There's something about the forgotten that whispers louder than the celebrated. Close your eyes for a moment. Not to sleep just yet, but to imagine. Imagine a time when the greatest excitement in a respectable household wasn't a new invention or a scandalous novel, but a plant. Not a rose with its theatrical perfume, not an orchid dripping with exotic promise, but something quieter. Something that grows in shadows and asks for nothing but dampness and patience. A fern. Tonight, we're stepping back into a world that moved slower, breathed deeper, and found wonder in the smallest curls of green. A world where middle-class Victorian school teachers, clerks, housewives, and gentlemen of modest means became utterly, inexplicably obsessed with collecting, growing, and cataloging ferns. They built glass cases for them. They pressed them into albums. They traveled miles through rain-soaked forests just to glimpse a rare variety growing on a moss-covered stone. They called it Pteridomania. Fern madness, and for decades, consumed them. This isn't a story of kings or wars or great inventions that changed the world. This is a story about quiet parlors lit by candlelight, about the rustle of petticoats on woodland paths, about the particular smell of damp earth and the gentle satisfaction of arranging fronds beneath a glass dome. It's about ordinary people finding extraordinary meaning in something, small and green and ancient. It's the kind of history that asks nothing of you but to listen, to drift, to let the past wash over you like mist through a Victorian garden. So settle in. Let the modern world fade. Let your breathing slow, because we're about to enter a greenhouse where time moves differently, where the only sound is water dripping from leaf to leaf, and where obsession wears a very gentle face. The Victorians had a peculiar relationship with passion. They were expected to be restrained, proper, measured in all things. Emotions were to be controlled, desires kept beneath the surface like roots in dark soil. And yet, beneath those starched collars and tight corsets, beneath the rigid etiquette and moral certainty, there burned a need, a hunger. Really, to feel something intensely? They found it in ferns, not in the obvious places. Not in the grand narratives of empire or industry, but in the small, secret corners of the natural world, in the things that curled and unfurled slowly, that asked for attention without demanding it, that rewarded patience with quiet. Beauty. Picture a drawing room in 1860. The air is heavy with the scent of beeswax and old paper. Afternoon light filters through lace curtains, casting shadows that look like fern fronds themselves. In the corner, beneath a glass case no larger than a hat box, grows a collection of miniature ferns each, one labeled in careful copperplate script. Each one positioned just so. The woman who tends them is unremarkable by history's standards. Her name won't appear in textbooks. She never wrote a famous book or led a social movement. But every Sunday, she walks 3 miles to the woods beyond town. Her boots growing heavy with mud, her fingers cold and damp, searching. Always searching for what? For a frond that's slightly different. For a variation in the pattern of leaflets. For the small, perfect joy of finding something living and bringing it home. This is where our story lives, not in the grand sweep of history, but in these small, repeated gestures, in the careful tending, the patient observation, the quiet pride of possession. The Victorians didn't see ferns the way we do now. To them, these plants were portals to something older than civilization. Survivors from an age when the world was young and strange. Ferns don't flower. They don't produce seeds like other plants. They reproduce through sporestiny dust-like particles that scatter on the wind. Ancient and mysterious. To study a fern was to touch deep time. To collect ferns was to build a bridge between the industrial present and the primordial past. And so they did, by the thousands. Clerks and countesses, children and scholars, all united by this singular, peculiar passion. They created fern gardens and fern grottos. They decorated their homes with fern patterns on wallpaper, on ceramics, on the very fabric of their lives. They gave ferns as gifts, pressed them into love letters, used them as bookmarks in Bibles. Ferns became a language, and like all languages, it spoke of things that couldn't quite be said aloud tonight. As you listen, you're entering that world. Not as a historian with a notebook, but as a guest in that Victorian drawing room. Watching the light fade, hearing the soft scritch of pen on paper as someone catalogs their collection. You can almost smell the earth, the green dampness. It's the particular mustiness of a plant that thrives in shadow. This is boring history. Yes, but boring in the best possible way. Boring like the sound of rain on glass. Boring like counting breaths before sleep. Boring like watching clouds drift across a summer sky. The kind of boring that lets your mind rest. The kind of boring that whispers. Asterisk, you don't have to chase excitement. You don't have to achieve or perform. You can simply exist, like a fern in a Victorian parlor, asking for nothing but a little light, a little water, a little time. Asterisk. So let's begin. Let's step back to a moment when the world was just discovering how to be modern, and people were desperately searching for ways to stay human. Let's talk about ferns. Every obsession has its stage, and the stage for fern mania was 19th century Britain, a place caught between two worlds, struggling to reconcile the mechanical with the natural, the future with the past. Imagine London in the 1820s and 1830s. The Industrial Revolution is in full.
Oh, choking bloom.
Factories rise like iron forests, their chimneys pumping smoke into skies that haven't seen clear blue in years. The air tastes of coal and ambition. The streets ring with the clatter of carts, the shouts of vendors, the constant, grinding noise of a civilization learning to run on steam and steel. It's exciting, certainly. It's progress, but it's also exhausting. For the first time in human history, vast numbers of people are living in cities, working not by the rhythm of seasons, but by the tyranny of the clock. Factory workers rise before dawn and return after dusk, never seeing daylight except on Sundays. The middle class that new, expanding category of people who are neither aristocrats nor laborers find themselves trapped in offices, counting ledgers, managing accounts, performing the administrative labor that keeps the empire running. The world is getting faster, louder, more crowded, and people are beginning to realize they've lost something. Not something they can name exactly. Not something they can point to and say, there, that's what's missing. But a feeling, a sense of connection to something older. Slower, more eternal than quarterly profits and train schedules. They've lost the green world. This is the soil, metaphorical and otherwise, from which fern mania would grow. The Victorians were profoundly anxious people. They worried about morality, about social status, about whether they were living correctly according to God's plan. They worried about the corrupting influence of cities, about the health of their children in smoke-filled air, about whether progress was leading them somewhere good or merely somewhere different. And so they began to look backward and outward toward nature, not wild nature. ITU. The Victorians weren't interested in untamed wilderness. That was dangerous, chaotic, uncivilized. No, they wanted nature that could be controlled, contained, made safe, and beautiful. Nature that could be brought indoors, studied, cataloged, and arranged according to proper principles. They wanted gardens, not jungles. They wanted terrariums. Not forests, they wanted ferns. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's stay in this moment a bit longer, this transitional period when Britain is becoming the workshop of the world. When the empire is expanding across continents, when everything seems possible, but also deeply uncertain, the class system is shifting. The old aristocracy, with its inherited lands and ancient titles, is having to make room for a new breed of wealthy industrialist men who made their fortunes in factories and railroads rather than inheriting them from ancestors. And beneath them both, a middle class is emerging: shopkeepers and clerks, teachers and bookkeepers, people with modest incomes and respectable positions. These middle-class Victorians are our
House
protagonists. They live in terraced houses with small gardens. They employ perhaps one servant, maybe two if they're doing well. They read novels and newspapers. They attend church on Sundays. They care deeply about appearances, about doing things properly, about maintaining their position in society's intricate hierarchy, They have some leisure time, not as much as the wealthy, but more than the working poor. And they need something to do with it. Enter hobbies. The 19th century was the great age of the hobby. Suddenly, ordinary people had the time and resources to pursue interests purely for pleasure. They collected stamps and coins. They sketched and painted. They studied geology and astronomy. They joined societies and clubs dedicated to every conceivable subject. And increasingly, they turned to botany. Plants were perfect for the Victorian mindset. They were improving collecting plants, taught you about God's creation and the order of nature. They were respectable. You could pursue botany without scandal or controversy. They were accessible. Britain's countryside was still within reach. And exotic plants were beginning to arrive from the empire's far-flung territories. Most importantly, plants were soothing. In a world of factory whistles and stock market panics, a plant asked nothing of you but patience. It grew at its own pace. It couldn't be hurried or optimized. It simply existed, green and quiet. A living reminder that not everything needed to be faster, louder, more profitable. The early decades of the 19th century saw a growing language of flowers, florography. It was called, every plant had symbolic meaning. Roses meant love, violets meant modesty, forget-me-nots meant exactly what their name suggested. Victorians, who struggled to express emotion directly, could say with flowers what they couldn't say aloud. But flowers were ephemeral. They bloomed and died. They were beautiful, but temporary. Ferns, on the other hand, endured. Ferns were ancient. They had existed since before the dinosaurs, had survived every extinction event, had carpeted the earth when it was young. They were prehistoric survivors, living fossils, connections to a time before human history even began, and they were beautiful in a different way then. Flowers not showy or temporary, but constant and intricate. Each frond was a masterpiece of symmetry, each leaflet arranged in patterns that seemed to follow some divine mathematics. To look closely at a fern was to see complexity within simplicity, order within nature. It was meditative. It was calming. It was exactly what the Victorians needed, but the obsession hadn't quite begun yet. In the 1820s and early 1830s, ferns were simply one more plant among many. Botanists studied them. Some people grew them in their gardens, but they weren't yet special. That was about to change. The conditions were perfect, restless. Anxious population seeking solace. A growing middle class with time and resources. An expanding print culture that could spread ideas rapidly. And a natural world that was still mysterious enough to inspire wonder. All that was needed was a spark. A reason for ferns to go from pleasant to essential. From background foliage to the center of national attention, that spark was coming, in fact. It was being invented in a London workshop at that very moment, a simple glass box that would change everything. That would make it possible for anyone, even city dwellers with no garden at all, to grow exotic ferns in their parlors, but we're not quite there yet. For now. We're still in the before time, in the quiet years before the madness began. London still smells of coal smoke. The middle class still searches for meaning in their newly leisured hours. And ferns still grow wild in the woods, unaware that they're about to become the most fashionable thing in Britain. Take a breath. Let the tension of this transitional moment settle into your bones, because everything is about to change. The world is about to go fern mad, and nothing will ever quite be the same again. Every great obsession has its prophet, and the prophet of fern mania was a London physician named Nathaniel Ward. The year is 1829. Dr. Ward isn't thinking about starting a horticultural revolution. He's simply trying to observe a moth. Picture him in his small London garden. If you can even call it a garden. It's more of a yard, really hemmed in by soot-stained brick walls, struggling under London's perpetual pall of coal smoke. He's a curious man, Dr. Ward, interested in natural history the way many educated Victorians aren't professionally. But as a respite from the demands of his medical practice, he's placed a moth chrysalis in a glass jar, sealed it, and set it on a shelf to watch the transformation. But the moth never emerges. Instead, something else does. In the bit of moist soil at the bottom of the jar, something is growing, a fern, a tiny fern, pushing up through the soil. Its fronds unfurling in that impossibly delicate way ferns have, as though they're unwrapping themselves from some ancient dream. Dr. Ward stares at it, puzzled. He hasn't planted anything. The jar is sealed. No rain can get in. No gardener can tend it. And yet here it is, thriving in its own little atmosphere, protected from London's polluted air. He watches it for weeks, then months, then years. The fern doesn't die. In fact, it flourishes, creating its own perfect ecosystem inside the glass moisture, condensing and dripping. Soil staying damp, air staying clean, by accident. Dr. Ward has invented the Terrarium, or as the Victorians will come to call it, the Wardian case. Now, you might think a glass box for plants isn't particularly revolutionary, but you'd be wrong. Because in 1829, London's air is so polluted that most delicate plants simply can't survive outdoors. The city's middle class, living in their terraced houses with small, smoky yards, have largely given up on growing anything interesting. But the Wardian case changes everything. Suddenly, it's possible to grow exotic plants indoors, protected from the elements. Suddenly, you don't need a greenhouse or a country estate. You don't need wealth or land. You just need a glass case and a sunny windowsill. For the first time, the exotic and beautiful become accessible to ordinary people. Dr. Ward, being a proper Victorian gentleman, doesn't keep his discovery to himself. In 1842, he publishes a book on the growth of plants in closely glazed cases. It's a modest work, technical and precise, but it spreads like wildfire through Britain's growing middle class. Soon, Wardian cases are being manufactured commercially. They come in all sizes: small ones for windowsills, large ones for conservatories, elaborate ones with ornate metalwork and miniature landscapes inside. Their status, symbols, and conversation pieces. Their parlor entertainment and botanical education all at once. And the plants people most want to grow in them? Ferns, because ferns, with their love of humidity and shade, are perfectly suited to life under glass. Because ferns, with their prehistoric mystique and intricate beauty, are exactly what Victorian aesthetics crave. Because ferns, unlike flowers, don't wither and die, they endure. Constant and green, little pieces of eternity sitting on your sideboard. The craze begins slowly, like most cultural shifts. A few enthusiasts, mostly middle-class professionals with scientific interests. They start collecting native British ferns. There are dozens of species, each with subtle variations. They learn to identify them, to catalog them, to trade specimens with fellow enthusiasts. Botanical societies form, fern clubs emerge. Nurseries begin specializing in ferns, cultivating them for sale. And then, inevitably, aristocracy takes notice. When wealthy people adopt a middle-class hobby, that hobby transforms. Suddenly, it's not enough to collect common British ferns. You need exotic species from the empire's far reaches: tree ferns from Australia, delicate varieties from India, strange specimens from South America. The Wardian case, it turns out, has a second revolutionary application: shipping plants across oceans. Before Ward's invention, importing live plants was nearly impossible. They'd die from salt spray, from temperature changes, from the dry air aboard ships. But in a sealed glass case, plants could travel for months, creating their own perfect atmosphere, arriving alive and healthy in British ports. The empire's botanical wealth could finally come home. Expeditions were funded. Collectors traveled to tropical jungles and remote mountains. They risked disease and danger to collect rare ferns, which would then make the long journey back to Britain sealed in Wardian cases, destined for the conservatories of the wealthy and the catalogs of commercial nurseries. By the 1840s, fern mania is building. By the 1850s, it's exploding. It's called Pteridomania, from the Greek pteris, meaning fern, and mania, meaning exactly what you think it means: madness, but such a gentle madness. Such a respectable obsession. No one's getting hurt after all. No fortunes are being destroyed. People are simply enthusiastic. They're attending lectures on fern reproduction. They're buying illustrated guides to British ferns. They're spending their Sundays in the countryside, carefully digging up specimens to bring home. The periodicals of the day begin running articles about ferns. Women's magazines publish tips on arranging fern displays. Children's books teach young readers how to identify species. Fern motifs appear on wallpaper and fabric, on ceramics and jewelry. It's everywhere, this obsession. It's woven into the very fabric of Victorian life. But what's actually driving it? Why ferns specifically? Why this particular plant at this particular moment? Partly, it's accessibility. Thanks to the Wardian case, anyone can grow ferns, regardless of garden space or gardening expertise. It's a democratization of the exotic, a way for ordinary people to participate in the empire's grand botanical collecting project. Partly it's science. The Victorian era is the age of amateur naturalism, when ordinary people contribute to human knowledge by carefully observing and cataloging the natural world. Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species won't be published until 1859. But the groundwork is being laid by thousands of amateur naturalists, including fern collectors who are documenting variation in distribution and living. Ferns are particularly fascinating scientifically because their reproduction is so mysterious. They don't flower. They don't produce seeds. They reproduce through spore-steiny dust-like particles that appear on the undersides of fronds. For centuries, no one understood how it worked. Some people thought ferns were magical, that they produced fern seed that could make you invisible if collected at midnight on Midsummer's Eve. Victorian botanists were slowly unraveling the mystery, discovering the complex life cycle of ferns, the way spores grow into tiny, heart-shaped gametophytes, which then produce the familiar frond-bearing plants. It was alien biology, stranger than fiction, and utterly captivating to anyone with a curious mind. But perhaps most importantly, fern mania is driven by emotion, by the Victorian need for calm in chaos, for nature in the industrial city, for beauty that doesn't demand or perform, but simply exists by the peculiar comfort of obsession itself, the way a focused passion can organize your days, give you purpose, connect you with others who share your interest, by the deep human need to collect, to categorize, to make sense of the world by arranging small pieces of it in glass cases. The spark has caught. The fire is spreading. In drawing rooms across Britain, ferns are unfurling under glass. In bookshops, guides to British ferns are selling out. In the countryside, Sunday strollers are searching hedgerows and stream
Thanks.
for rare specimens. The mania is here, and it's only going to grow stranger. More widespread, more completely consuming, but for now, in this moment of ignition, there's still wonder. Still the simple joy of discovering that something as ordinary as a fern can become extraordinary if you look closely enough, care deeply enough, pay attention. Dr. Ward, in his London home, tends his accidental terrarium. He has no idea that his moth jar has changed history, that his name will be attached to one of the Victorian era's defining obsessions. He just knows that the fern is beautiful, and that sometimes the smallest things contain worlds. They called them Sunday. Botanists, these gentle armies of fern, collectors who descended upon the British countryside every week. Picture a Sunday morning in 1855. The church bells have rung. Services have concluded. Respectable middle-class families have eaten their midday meal. And now, in the early afternoon, they're preparing for their weekly expedition. Not to another social call, not to a park for idle strolling, but into the woods. Into the damp green places where ferns grow. The father carries a small spade and a basket lined with damp moss. The mother has a collecting tin and a magnifying glass on a ribbon around her neck. The children, 2 daughters in practical wool dresses, a son in short pants and suspenders each, have small trowels. And the kind of intense focus that comes from having a mission. They're hunting. Not for anything dramatic. Not for tigers or treasure. They're hunting for ferns. Specifically, they're searching for a particular variety of heart-stung fern that was reported growing near the old stone bridge 2 miles west of town. They've read about it in the Gardener's Chronicle. They've studied illustrations in their well-worn copy of British ferns and their allies. And now they're determined to find it, dig it up carefully, and add it to their collection. This is fern mania at its most widespread, not the wealthy. Collectors with their conservatories and their exotic imports, but ordinary people, thousands of them, taking to the countryside with tools and determination. Let's follow them for a while. Let's walk at their pace, which is slower than you might think. Because fern hunting isn't about speed, it's about attention. They leave the road and follow a footpath that winds into the woods. The transition is immediate from open sky to green-filtered light, from the sounds of the town to the hush of the forest. The air changes too, growing cooler, damper, scented with moss and decay and that particular mineral smell of water running over stone. The children run ahead initially, excited, but the parents call them back. Slowly, the father says, "You'll miss it if you hurry." They begin to notice here, growing on a fallen log, a cluster of polypody ferns. Their fronds a brilliant green against the dark wood. Common, certainly not worth collecting, but beautiful nonetheless. The daughter pauses to touch one, feeling the way the leaflets are slightly textured. The way they spring back when released. They're on a mossy bank, what might be a male fern, but they'll need to look closer to be sure. The father crouches down, produces his magnifying glass, examines the underside of a frond where the spore clusters are, arranged in neat rows. "Male fern indeed," he announces, and there's satisfaction in his voice. The pleasure of correct identification. They continue deeper into the woods, following the sound of water. Ferns love moisture, so stream banks and waterfall edges are prime hunting grounds. The path grows muddy. The mother's skirts are getting heavy with damp, but she doesn't complain. Her attention is focused entirely on the banks around them, scanning for unusual shapes, unexpected variations, and then, there. The son has spotted at a cluster of ferns growing on the shaded side of a large stone. Their fronds longer and more strap-like than the divided fronds of most ferns. Heart-stung fern, a Splenium scalopendrium. The very species they were searching for. The family gathers around it. And for a moment, they simply look. This is part of the ritual to the appreciation before collection. The acknowledgement that this living thing is beautiful in its current location. That taking it is a responsibility as much as a right. The father begins to dig carefully, trying to get the roots without damaging them. The soil here is thin, mostly leaf litter and moss over rock. It takes patience. The children watch intently, learning. Finally, the fern comes free, roots intact, still surrounded by a ball of its native soil. It's wrapped carefully in damp moss and placed in the basket. It will be taken home, potted in a mixture of peat and sand, placed in their Wardian case, and tended with the kind of careful attention most people reserve for family heirlooms. This family will add it to a collection that already includes 12 other species of British ferns, each labeled with its scientific name, location of collection, and date found. The father keeps a notebook where he records details about each specimen growth patterns, spore development, any unusual characteristics. He's not a scientist, this man. He's a bank clerk, but on Sundays, for these few hours, he's a naturalist, a collector, a participant in the great Victorian project of cataloging the natural world, and he's not alone. All across Britain, thousands of others are doing exactly the same thing. Teachers and shopkeepers, retired military officers and unmarried women, elderly gentlemen with too much time, and young families seeking wholesome entertainment, all of them walking woodland paths, examining stream banks, carefully digging up ferns. Some are methodical collectors, determined to possess every British species. Others are more casual, simply enjoying the excuse to be outdoors, to exercise their identification skills. To participate in a fashionable hobby, the women especially find something liberating in fern hunting. Victorian gender roles are strict. Women are expected to be domestic, decorative, morally uplifting, but not intellectually ambitious. But botany is considered acceptable for women. It's scientific enough to be intellectually stimulating, but natural enough to be feminine. A woman can be a serious fern collector without threatening her respectability, in fact. Some of the era's most accomplished pteridologists, fern specialists, are women. They write articles for botanical journals. They correspond with other collectors across the country. They develop expertise that rivals any man's, and they do it all within the acceptable boundaries of a hobby. For a few hours each Sunday in the quiet of the forest, these women can be authorities. They can be experts. They can be something other than wives and mothers. And as daughters, they can be botanists. The family we've been following is heading home now, tired but satisfied. They've found what they were searching for. Their boots are caked with mud. The children are damp and slightly scratched from pushing through underbrush. But they're happy. They'll have tea when they get home. They'll pot the new fern carefully. They'll arrange their Wardian case, perhaps moving some specimens to create a more pleasing composition. The way one might arrange furniture in a dollhouse. And already, they're planning next Sunday's expedition. There's a rocky outcrop 5 miles north where someone reported finding a rare variety of buckler fern. It'll be a longer walk, but the weather should hold. This is what obsession looks like at ground level, not dramatic or destructive. Patient and recurring. A steady drumbeat of attention paid, effort made, small triumphs celebrated. Multiplied this family by thousands. Imagine all those Sunday expeditions happening simultaneously across England, Scotland, Wales, all those careful hands digging, all those magnifying glasses examining, all those notebooks recording. It's a quiet army, really. An army of gentle obsessives, marching not to conquest, but to catalog. Seeking not to dominate nature, but to possess small pieces of it. To bring the green world home, the forest paths are wearing down from all this foot traffic. The stream banks are becoming depleted of certain species. Some rare ferns are growing rarer as collectors dig them up. But we're not quite to the consequences yet. Right now, we're still in the golden period of the mania. When the countryside seems inexhaustible, and the joy of finding exceeds any thought of loss. The sun is lowering. The forest is growing quiet. Our family of fern hunters is walking home through the long shadows of late afternoon, and in the basket, wrapped in damp moss, a heart-stung fern is making its journey from wild to domestic. From stream bank to Wardian case, from nature to collection. Tomorrow, the father will return to his desk at the bank. The mother will manage the household. The children will do their lessons. But every time they pass the Wardian case in the parlor, they'll remember. They'll remember the green quiet of the forest, the cold water running over stone. The perfect moment of discovery when they spotted the fern growing exactly where it was supposed to be. They'll remember being, for a few hours, something more than their daily roles. They'll remember being explorers in a miniature jungle. Scientists on an expedition, collectors on the hunt, and next Sunday, they'll do it all again. Now we leave the forest and step indoors into the parlor. That most Victorian of spaces, where public and private meet, where families both live and perform. The door closes behind us. The late afternoon light filters through lace curtains. The air is different here, not cold and damp like the woods, but warm and slightly humid. With that distinctive greenhouse smell of soil and green growing things, because this isn't an ordinary parlor. This is a fern room. Let's look around slowly, the way a Victorian visitor would, taking in each carefully arranged detail. Against the far wall, dominating the room, stands a large Wardian case, perhaps 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall. Its glass panels spotless, despite the impossibility of keeping anything clean in a coal-burning city. Inside, a miniature landscape has been created. A tiny grotto made of stones and moss, with ferns of various sizes arranged to create depth and perspective. The largest specimens are at the back, creating a sense of height. Smaller ones cascade from the rocks in the middle ground. Tiny, delicate ferns edge the front like lace trim on a dress. It's not just a collection, it's a composition. A living diorama of an idealized forest floor. Each fern is labeled with a small metal tag stamped with its Latin name, Polypodium vulgare, Dryopteris, Filix maz, Ethereum Filix femina. The names are like poetry, like incantations. Speaking them correctly is part of the pleasure, part of the performance of expertise, but the large Wardian case is just the beginning. On the windowsill, smaller glass cases, each containing a single prized specimen. A delicate maidenhair fern from Jamaica, its fronds trembling when anyone walks past. A mother fern from the Azores, with tiny plantlets growing on its fronds, viviparity, it's called, and it's considered quite remarkable. A bird's nest fern from India, its fronds emerging from a central crown like a living fountain. On side tables throughout the room, fern albums. These are large books, their pages filled with pressed and dried fern specimens, each carefully mounted and labeled. They're works of art, really, the Victorian equivalent of photo albums. But instead of family portraits, they contain fern portraits. Each frond pressed flat, its intricate structure preserved. A record of collection and classification. Visitors will be invited to look through these albums. It's a ritual, a form of parlor entertainment. This one I collected in the Lake District in 1856, the hostess will say, turning pages carefully. And this one came from a fern grotto in Devon. Rather rare. Note the unusual serration on the pinnules. The visitors will make appropriate sounds of admiration. They'll share stories of their own collecting expeditions. They'll discuss the finer points of fern cultivation, the best soil mixtures, the ideal humidity levels, the challenges of preventing scale insects. This is social currency now. Fern knowledge is a marker of education, of refined taste, of having the leisure time to pursue such genteel interests. On the walls, fern art, framed prints from illustrated botanical books, showing ferns rendered in meticulous detail. Watercolors painted by the lady of the house herself, fern fronds arranged in graceful compositions. Their colors slightly exaggerated to create a more pleasing effect. And the patterns, oh, the patterns everywhere. The wallpaper features stylized fern fronds, repeated in endless symmetry. The upholstery fabric on the settee shows fern motifs woven into the design. Even the carpet has fern-like shapes in its border. The Victorians loved patterns, loved repetition and order. And ferns, with their mathematical precision, the way each frond is divided into pinnae. Each pinna divided into pinnules. All arranged in perfect symmetry were nature's own geometry lesson. To surround yourself with fern patterns was to bring nature's order into your home. To create a domestic space that reflected the divine mathematics of creation. There's something almost obsessive about it, seeing these patterns everywhere. It's as though the entire room is trying to become a forest. As though the occupants are attempting to live inside a Wardian case, surrounded by green. And in some sense, that's exactly what's happening. Because for many Victorians, particularly those in the growing cities, the home becomes a refuge from the industrial world outside. The parlor is a sealed environment, carefully controlled, kept as clean as possible despite the coal smoke that seeps through every crack. It's a glass case for humans, protected space where the family can exist separate from the pollution and chaos of modern life. Ferns are both decoration and aspiration. They're proof that life can flourish even in the city, that beauty can be maintained, that a connection to the natural world can be preserved through glass and careful tending. Let's sit down in this room for a moment. Let's imagine spending an evening here. The gas lamps are lit now, carefully adjusted so their heat doesn't stress the ferns. The family gathers. The father reads the newspaper, occasionally looking up to check the moisture level in the Wardian case. The mother works on her embroidery, a fern pattern, naturally, which she's copying from a ladies' magazine. The daughter practices her piano, and even the music has a fern connection. She's learning a piece called The Fern Gatherer's Return. It's a popular parlor song about the joys of collecting. This is domestic life in the age of Pteridomania. It's quiet, ordered green. It's a life organized around these plants, the daily checking of moisture levels, the weekly cleaning of glass panels, the seasonal repotting of specimens that have outgrown their containers. And it's not just this family. This scene is being replicated in thousands of homes across Britain. In terraced houses and detached villas, in the homes of clerks and doctors and shop owners, ferns are taking over. Some families go further. They build dedicated fern houses in their gardens. Small glass structures, precursors to modern greenhouses devoted entirely to fern cultivation. They compete to see who can grow the most exotic species, who can create the most naturalistic fern grotto. Fern grottos become a particular session outdoor spaces designed to mimic the damp, shaded environments where ferns naturally thrive. Families dig out shaded corners of their gardens, build artificial stone formations, create small waterfalls and pools. They plant ferns in every available crevice, turning a corner of suburban England into a simulacrum of a tropical ravine. These grottos are places of retreat, of contemplation. You can sit there on a warm day, surrounded by green, listening to water trickle, and pretend you're somewhere far from factories and offices. Somewhere ancient and unchanged, you can pretend for a moment. That time moves differently. The symbolism of ferns extends beyond the merely aesthetic. In the Victorian language of flowers floriography, ferns carry specific meanings. They represent fascination, sincerity, and magic. To give someone a fern is to say, "You fascinate me. I am sincere in my regard. There is something mysterious about you that I wish to understand." Young men give preserved fern fronds to young women they're courting. The fronds are pressed between the pages of poetry books, given as bookmarks in volumes of romantic verse. The message is clear without being too forward. I notice you. I think you're worth studying. Ferns are also associated with humility and solitude. They grow in shade. They don't shout for attention. They're content to be overlooked until someone takes the time to really see them. In a society that values restraint and propriety, these are appealing qualities. The drawing room fern collection becomes, in a sense, a statement about the family that tends it. It says, "We are refined people who appreciate nature's subtlety. We have the patience to care for delicate things. We have the education to know Latin names. We have the leisure to pursue hobbies. We are, in short, respectable, and respectability in Victorian Britain is everything." The evening draws on. The father makes his final rounds, checking each fern, adjusting the position of a case to catch better morning light. The mother banks the fire carefully. Too much heat will dry out the air, stressing the ferns. The children are sent to bed, but not before saying goodnight to the Wardian case, which has become almost a member of the family. Outside, the city clatters on. Somewhere, factories are still running night shifts. Somewhere, trains are pulling into stations. Somewhere, the machinery of empire and industry turns relentlessly. But here, in this room of green and glass, time is different, quieter, measured not by clocks, but by growth, the slow unfurling of fronds, the gradual emergence of new shoots, the patient accumulation of collection. The ferns ask nothing but attention. And in return, they give these Victorians something precious, a sense that life can be more than the grind of work and worry. That beauty is achievable, that the natural world, though retreating, hasn't been lost entirely. It can be kept. It can be tended. It can live in your parlor, behind glass, green, and eternal. Or at least, that's the dream. The dream of the Wardian case, of the cultivated fern, of nature made domestic and safe. A dream that thousands of Victorians are living, night after quiet night. There's a letter sitting on a mahogany writing desk in a London townhouse. It's 1862, and the paper is fine cream vellum, slightly scented with lavender. The handwriting is careful, feminine. The ink, a delicate shade of brown, but it's what's pressed between the pages that matters. A fern frond, small, delicate, perfectly preserved. Adiantum capillus veneris, the maidenhair fern. With its tiny, fan-shaped leaflets arranged along black stems as fine as hair, the letter says very little of consequence. It discusses the weather, a recent church service, plans for a garden party. But the fern says everything the words cannot. In the intricate, unspoken language of Victorian floriography, this particular fern carries a message: fascination. To send someone a maidenhair fern is to say, without the vulgarity of speaking it aloud, you captivate me. I cannot stop thinking about you. Young woman who sent this letter has never been alone with the young man who will receive it. They've met exactly 3 times, always in the company of others. They've exchanged perhaps 50 words between them. But she's thought about him constantly for 6 months. She cannot tell him this directly. That would be improper. Forward. It's potentially scandalous. But she can press a fern into a letter. And if he understands, if he's versed in the language of plants, as any educated Victorian should be, he'll know, this is how the Victorians courted, through indirection, through symbolism. Through the careful selection of flowers and ferns that could carry messages too dangerous to speak, floriography. The language of flowers had been popular since the early part of the century. Dictionaries were published explaining the meanings of hundreds of plants. Young women memorized them the way modern teenagers memorize text message shorthand. Every bouquet was a coded communication. Every garden arrangement told a story. Roses, of course, dominated the vocabulary. Red for passionate love, white for purity, yellow for friendship or jealousy, depending on the source. But roses were obvious, theatrical, almost vulgar in their expressiving there. Ferns were subtler, more sophisticated, more suited to deep, quiet emotions than to grand declarations. Different ferns carried different meanings, though the interpretations sometimes varied between published sources, leading to occasional miscommunication that might have been comic if the participants weren't so deeply serious about it. Generally, ferns as a category represented sincerity, magic, fascination, and humility. They were plants of shade and secret places, and thus became symbols for hidden feelings. For emotions that couldn't be displayed in bright sunlight, the maidenhair fern, with its delicate beauty, meant fascination and discretion. The heart-stung fern, with its simple, undivided fronds, represented truth and sincerity. The royal fern, largest of the British species, signified majesty and reverence. The bracken common, and hardy sometimes, represented solitude or shelter, more specifically. Pressed ferns, given as gifts or bookmarks, or sent in letters, were ways of saying things that couldn't be said in ordinary conversation. Man couldn't tell a woman he was fascinated by her unless they were formally courting, and often not even then, not directly. But he could give her a book of poetry with a pressed fern marking a particular romantic verse. She would understand. And if she reciprocated, she might send him a letter. With a fern pressed into the pages, this delicate dance of botanical symbolism allowed Victorian young people to communicate despite the rigid social conventions that constrained them. It gave them a language for interiority, for private feeling, for the self that existed behind the proper, public face. Imagine being a young Victorian woman, educated but with limited prospects, expected to be decorative and moral, but not too intelligent, not too opinionated. Your days are carefully structured around social obligations and domestic tasks. Your future will be determined by whether you make an appropriate marriage, but you have feelings. You have desires. You have thoughts that you're not supposed to voice. The fern you press between pages, the fern you arrange in a vase, the fern you sketch in your journal. These become expressions of interior life. They become ways of saying, asterisk, I exist. I feel. I notice the world, asterisk, and if someone else notices the ferns you've chosen, if someone else understands their symbolism, suddenly you're not alone. Suddenly there's connection, communication, common understanding, all without speaking a word that might compromise your respectability. This is why ferns weren't just botanical specimens or decorative objects. They were emotional vocabulary. Let's visit another parlor, another evening. 2 women are sitting together, working on their fern albums. They're cousins, unmarried, living together in a house inherited from their late father. They're in their 30s, old by Victorian marriage standards, unlikely to wed now. They don't speak much as they work. One is mounting a recently dried specimen a lady fern collected on their last Sunday expedition. The other is carefully writing labels in a precise, tiny hand. This is companionship without romance, but it's no less significant for that. These women have built a life together around their shared interest. They've created their own small world of fern grottos and Wardian cases and Sunday expeditions and quiet evenings like this. The ferns are their language to not of romantic love, but of partnership, of shared purpose, of the possibility that life can have meaning and beauty even outside the narrow path Victorian society prescribes for women. When they discover a new species, when they successfully propagate a difficult specimen, when they create a particularly beautiful arrangement, they're saying to each other, asterisk, this matters. We matter. What we built together is valuable. Asterisk. The symbolism of ferns extends beyond interpersonal communication to broader cultural meaning. Ferns are ancient. They predate flowering plants by hundreds of millions of years. Victorian naturalists were beginning to understand geological time, to grasp that Earth's history stretched back far beyond the biblical timescale. Ferns were fossils and coal seams, reminders that the world was once completely different. To study ferns was to touch deep time, to hold in your hand a form of life that had existed since before human history, before human existence, before the world as humans knew it had taken shape, in an era of rapid change, when railroads were shrinking distance, when telegraph wires were shrinking time, when industry was reshaping landscape and society. Ferns represented continuity. They'd survived every extinction event. They'd outlasted dinosaurs and ice ages. They were constants in an inconstant world. For Victorians anxious about progress and change, about whether civilization was advancing or degrading, about what was being lost in the rush toward modernity, ferns were reassuring. They said, asterisk, life persists. Beauty endures. Some things remain. Asterisk ferns also carried spiritual significance. Their mysterious reproduction, no visible flowers or seeds, just dust-like spores appearing on frond undersides, seemed almost miraculous. Folk traditions held that ferns bloomed once a year. At midnight, on Midsummer's Eve, producing a magical seed that could grant invisibility or reveal hidden treasure. This was folklore, not fact. But it captured something about how ferns were perceived as liminal creatures, existing between the visible and invisible, the known and mysterious, the natural and supernatural. Victorian Christianity was trying to reconcile itself with science, with geology's deep time and biology's implications about species change. Some saw nature study as a way to understand God's creation, to read divine intention in the structure of plants and animals. Ferns, with their mathematical precision, their perfect symmetry, their fractal patterns repeating at different scales, seemed like proof of divine design. Each frond was a demonstration of natural order, beauty emerging from simple rules applied consistently. To collect and study ferns was, for some, a spiritual practice. It was meditation. It was prayer without words. It was attention paid to creation. The letter we began with, the one with the pressed maidenhair fern, has been delivered now. The young man holds it in his hands, alone in his rooms. He reads the words, which are polite and meaningless. Then he carefully extracts the pressed fern, holds it up to the lamplight, examines its delicate structure. He recognizes it. Maidenhair. Fascination. His heart performs. Something complicate a mixture of excitement and terror, because now he must respond. Now he must decide whether to acknowledge the message, whether to reciprocate, whether to begin the careful dance that might lead to courtship, engagement, marriage. He goes to his own collection, to his own pressed fern specimens. He selects a heart-stung frond, sincerity, truth. He finds his nicest paper. He writes a letter even more meaningless than hers. It's discussing nothing of consequence, and he presses the fern between the pages. When she receives it and she finds the heart's tongue, she'll understand. He's saying, asterisk, I am sincere. My regard is truthful. Asterisk, and so it begins. Not with words, not with touches, but with ferns. With green things pressed flat and sent between pages, carrying meanings too important to trust to language. This is the poetry of Pteridomania. Not just the collecting, not just the scientific study, but this. The use of living things to express interior worlds, to bridge the gap between isolated selves, to say what cannot be said. Multiply these two letters by thousands. Imagine all over Victorian Britain, young people and old people, men and women, friends and lovers, sending pressed ferns, arranging fern bouquets, using these ancient plants as vocabulary for modern feeling. The ferns themselves don't know they're symbolic. They're simply growing, reproducing, existing as they've existed for hundreds of millions of years. But humans need meaning. Humans need language. Humans need ways to say, asterisk, I see you. You matter. You're not alone. Asterisk, and for the Victorians, for these particular decades, ferns became that language. The evening deepens. The letters are sent. The meanings are understood or misunderstood. Ferns pressed and dried will last for decades, outliving many of the people who sent them, silent witnesses to long-ago emotions. To carefully coded communications in an age when so much had to remain unsaid, but the ferns remember nothing. They're just plant matter now. Chlorophyll faded to brown, structure preserved, but life gone. Yet somehow, even dead and pressed, they still carry meaning. Even silent, they still speak. Now we descend into mystery, into the strange secret life cycle of ferns that captivated Victorian naturalists and baffled them in equal measure. Picture a Victorian gentleman scientist in his study. It's late evening. The house is quiet. On the desk before him, illuminated by lamplight, lies a single fern frond, positioned carefully under a magnifying glass. He's examining the underside. Where neat rows of brown spots are arranged along each leaflet, the spots look like punctuation marks, like nature's own notation system written in a language he's trying to decode. These are sorry clusters of sporangia, structures that produce spores. He knows this much. But he doesn't fully understand what happens next. No one does. Not completely. The life cycle of ferns remains, even in 1860, partially mysterious. For centuries, ferns were considered magical specifically because of their reproduction. They didn't flower. They didn't produce visible seeds. Where other plants were obvious in their sexuality, showy flowers attracting pollinators, yet fruits enclosing seeds, ferns were obscure, hidden, seemingly reproducing by pure magic. Medieval folklore held that ferns bloomed once a year, at midnight on Midsummer's Eve, producing seeds of invisibility. Shakespeare referenced this belief, as people actually went into forests at midnight hoping to witness the impossible flowering. To catch the magical seeds in white cloths, of course, they never did. Because ferns don't flower, don't produce seeds. But the mystery of how they did reproduce remained unsolved for surprisingly long. Let's lean in close, look through the magnifying glass with our gentleman scientist, and understand what the Victorians were slowly discovering: the brown spots. On the underside of the fronda, contain hundreds of tiny sporangia. Each sporangium is like a miniature catapult, designed by millions of years of evolution to launch spores into the air. When conditions are right, when humidity drops slightly, the sporangium dries and contracts, building tension. Then suddenly, it ruptures, flinging spores into the air with surprising force. Our scientist has witnessed this. He's seen the golden dust puff up from a fern frond, has watched the spores drift in the lamplight like pollen, like fairy dust, like something from a dream rather than from biology. But here's where it gets strange. Those spores aren't seeds. They don't grow directly into new fern plants. Instead, they grow into something completely different, something most Victorians never saw because it's tiny and easily overlooked. The spore, if it lands in a damp place, germinates. But instead of producing a frond, it produces something called a prothallusus small. Heart-shaped structure, usually green, usually no more than a quarter-inch across, looks nothing like a fern. It looks like a tiny piece of green tissue living inconspicuously on damp soil or rock. This is the gametophyte, the sexual stage of the fern life cycle. On the underside of this tiny prothallus, in films of water, male and female reproductive structures develop. The male structures produce sperm, actual swimming sperm cells. The female structures produce eggs when conditions are wet enough. When there's a film of water on the prothallus surface, the sperms actually swim to the eggs and fertilize them. And only then, only after this weird, hidden sexual encounter between microscopic structures on a heart-shaped thing that doesn't look like a fern at all, does a new fern plant begin to grow. This is called alternation of generations, and it's completely unlike what happens in flowering plants. It's completely unlike anything most people would expect. The fern plant, you see the one with the beautiful fronds, is actually the asexual generation, the sporophyte. Its job is just to produce spores. The sexual reproduction happens in the tiny prothallus stage that most people never notice. Victorian. Naturalists were slowly piecing this together through decades of careful observation. Different scientists discovered different parts of the puzzle. There were debates, controversies, rival theories. Our gentleman scientist has read all the papers. He subscribed to the botanical journals. It's part of this grand collective project of understanding. Tonight, he's attempting to observe the prothallus stage himself. He set up a small glass dish with damp soil, sprinkled with spores from his collection ferns. Checks it daily, watching for the green hearts to appear. It requires immense patience. The process is slow. The structures are tiny. Success is uncertain. But this is exactly what appeals to the Victorian temperament. This combination of scientific rigor and patient observation. This sense of participating in the advancement of human knowledge through careful attention to small things. The science of fern steridology was becoming increasingly sophisticated. Specialists could identify hundreds of species and varieties. They understood that the fronds emerge coiled fiddleheads, are called because of their resemblance to the scroll of a violin. They understood that ferns are vascular plants, with specialized tissues for transporting water and nutrients. They were learning to classify ferns into families and genera, to understand evolutionary relationships, to see patterns in the seemingly endless variation of form. But the spore prothallus fertilization cycle remained mysterious and wonderful. It violated expectations, demonstrated that nature was stranger than common sense would suggest. For Victorian naturalists trying to reconcile religion and science, trying to understand whether species were fixed creations or mutable forms, ferns provided intriguing evidence, because ferns showed incredible variation. The same species could produce different forms depending on growing conditions, fronds longer or shorter, more divided or less, adapting to light levels and moisture. Were these different species, or variations of one species? Were they fixed forms, or plastic responses to environment? These questions were being debated as Charles Darwin worked on his theory of natural selection. Amateur fern collectors documenting variation in their collected specimens were contributing data to these larger questions without necessarily realizing it. The relationship between Victorian fern mania and the scientific revolution happening around evolutionary theory is complex. Many fern collectors were religious people who saw their hobby as a way to appreciate God's creation. They weren't looking for evidence of evolution or species mutability, but they were accumulating that evidence anyway. Through their careful documentation, their notes on variation, their pressed specimens showing the range of forms a single species could take. Our scientist sits back, rubbing his eyes. Lamplight wavers. Outside, the city is dark and quiet. He's been examining ferns for 3 hours. And he'll be tired tomorrow at his day job as a solicitor. But there's this pursuit of understanding. This patient attention to the mysteries of reproduction and growth and variation. This feels more important than contracts and property law. This feels like truth. There's something almost hypnotic about studying ferns. The repetitive structures, the way each frond is divided into pinnae, each pinna into pinnules, each pinnule sometimes divided further, all following the same pattern at different scales. It's fractal before anyone had that word. It's natural mathematics, the universe expressing itself through geometry. To study a fern is to study patterns. And patterns, the Victorians believed, revealed underlying order. Divine order, perhaps? Natural law, certainly. The spores are drifting now, disturbed by his breath. Tiny golden particles catch the light, spinning slowly in the air before settling on the desk, the books, the glass dishes. Each spore contains the potential for an entire life cycle: the prothalus stage, the fertilization, the new sporophyte, the fronds that will eventually produce more spores. It's a circle, an endless repetition, form of immortality. Individual ferns die, but the cycle continues. It's continued for hundreds of millions of years. It will continue long after this gentleman scientist is dust, after his house has crumbled, after Victorian England itself has become just another layer in the fossil record. There's comfort in that somehow, in the endurance of patterns, in the persistence of cycles. The Victorians needed comfort. They were living through terrifying changes: industrialization, urbanization, the collapse of old certainties about the age of Earth and the origin of species. The ground was shifting beneath them, literally and figuratively. But ferns had survived worse. Had survived the extinction of dinosaurs, the ice ages, the continental drift that reshaped the planet. But ferns had survived worse. Had survived the extinction of dinosaurs, the ice ages, the continental drift that reshaped the planet. If ferns could endure, perhaps humanity could too. Our scientist carefully covers his specimens, banks the lamp, prepares for bed. Tomorrow, he'll return to the world of human affairs, contracts and clients, and the ordinary business of life. But tonight, for these hours, he's touched something older. He's participated in the patient collective work of understanding life's mysteries. He's been, in his small way, a scientist. And the spores, invisible now in darkness, wait on their glass dish for moisture, for conditions to be right, for the next stage of their ancient cycle to begin. The mystery continues. The cycle turns. The pattern repeats. And somewhere in forests and gardens all across Britain, other ferns are releasing other spores, continuing the dance that began long before humans walked the earth, that will continue long after. Silent, patient, eternal, the way only the very old things can be. Imagine it's walking into a Victorian home in 1865 before you notice the Wardian cases. Before you see the fern grotto visible through the back window, you notice the patterns, the wallpaper climbing every wall, stylized fern fronds repeating in endless symmetry, green on cream, or sometimes silver on deep blue. The fabric covering the settee, ferns again, woven into the textile. The border of the carpet beneath your feet, more ferns, simplified to their essential curve, repeated until they become almost abstract. The ceramic pitcher on the sideboard, decorated with painted ferns. The frame around the mirror, carved with fern motifs. The cover of the book lying on the side table, embossed with fern patterns. Even the tea set, it's brought out for guests, features ferns delicately painted on bone china. You could not escape ferns in this house. They were everywhere, in every form, on every surface. Living specimens, pressed specimens, endlessly repeated decorative images of ferns. This is what happens when an obsession reaches critical mass. It stops being merely a hobby and becomes an aesthetic, a style, a visual language that permeates material culture. The Victorian era was the first age of mass-produced decorative goods. The Industrial Revolution that had polluted the air and filled cities with factories also made possible the inexpensive production of wallpapers, textiles, ceramics, and printed materials. For the first time, ordinary middle-class people could afford to decorate their homes with patterned goods, and they wanted fern patterns. Publishers responded to Pteridomania with an avalanche of fern-related books. There were scientific works, illustrated guides to British ferns, complete with hand-colored plates showing each species in meticulous detail. These were expensive volumes, but they sold surprisingly well. Families saved for them, displayed them prominently, studied them carefully. The illustrations in these books are beautiful even now. Artists spent hours rendering each frond, each sorus pattern, each subtle variation in color and form. The best illustrations have a quality that goes beyond scientific accuracy into something like reverence, as though the artist saw in ferns something sacred, something worth preserving with every careful pen stroke. These books served multiple purposes. They were identification guides for collectors. They were proof of education and refined taste. They were coffee table books avant la lettre, designed to be displayed and discussed, to demonstrate the owner's membership in the community of fern enthusiasts. But scientific works were just the beginning. The publishing industry produced popular books about ferns too, guides for beginners. Memoirs of fern hunting expeditions, poetry collections, celebrating ferns, even children's books teaching young readers to identify common species. There were periodicals dedicated to ferns magazines, where collectors could share tips on cultivation, report discoveries of rare varieties, and debate the finer points of classification. Letters to the editor debated whether a particular form was a distinct species or merely a variant. Advertisements promoted new Wardian case designs, rare specimens for sale. Upcoming lecture series on pteridology, this print culture created a sense of community among fern enthusiasts. A collector in Cornwall could correspond with another in Yorkshire through letters to the magazine. They could share knowledge, trade specimens, feel themselves part of a national, even international movement. The illustrated fern books did something else. Too, they made ferns into art. With a capital A, the careful engravings, the hand-colored plates, the decorative borders featuring stylized fronds, these transformed botanical specimens into aesthetic objects. A fern was no longer just a plant. It was a subject worthy of artistic attention, of beauty for its own sake. This fed back into decorative culture. Artists and designers took the forms they saw in botanical illustration and adapted them for wallpaper. Fabric, ceramics, metalwork, the fern became a design motif. Like the acanthus leaves of classical architecture or the floral patterns of earlier decorative traditions. But ferns had an advantage. Their structure was perfect for pattern making. The way fronds are divided and subdivided, the symmetry of leaflets along a central stalk, the curve of the frond as it emerges and unfurls, all of this translated beautifully into repeating patterns. Walk through the wallpaper section of a modern museum that collects Victorian decorative arts, and you'll see what fern mania produced, pattern after pattern, design after design, all based on fern forms. Some are naturalistic, attempting to recreate the appearance of actual ferns. Others are highly stylized, reducing the fern to its geometric essence, curves and repetitions, symmetries and divisions. The best Victorian designers understood that ferns worked as decoration precisely because they were mathematically elegant. The patterns pleased the eye because they followed natural proportions, because they had the harmony that comes from organic growth rather than arbitrary human imposition. This idea that nature's patterns were inherently beautiful and should be studied and adapted for design was central to the Victorian aesthetic movement. Designers believed that industrial mass production didn't have to mean ugliness, that machine-made objects could be beautiful if they were based on natural forms. Ferns became a test case for this philosophy. Could a wallpaper machine reproduce nature's beauty? Could a ceramics factory capture the grace of a fern frond? The Victorians believed the answer was yes, and they papered their walls with the evidence. There were critics, of course. Some complained that fern patterns were overused, that they'd become cliché. The design reformer Charles Eastlake, in his influential 1868 book on household taste, warned against excessive naturalism in pattern, arguing that decorative art should be more abstract, more stylized. But the fern patterns continued, because they weren't just about aesthetics. They were about meaning. To surround yourself with fern patterns was to signal your participation in a cultural moment. It was to align yourself with nature, with science, with the respectable middle-class values that fern collecting represented. It was to make your home into a kind of Wardian case, protected space where nature's beauty was preserved and displayed. Consider the experience of a woman doing embroidery in such a room. She's working on a pattern ferns, naturally, copied from a ladies' magazine. The wallpaper behind her, ferns. The fabric she's embroidering will be used to cover a cushion, adding more ferns to the room's decorative scheme. She's surrounded by repetition, by pattern. By the same forms rendered over and over at different scales and in different media, it might seem obsessive. It might seem like too much, but remember, for the Victorians, repetition was soothing. Pattern was reassuring. The same forms repeated across different contexts created a sense of unity, of coherence, of a world that made sense, in an age of anxiety and rapid change. When the future was uncertain and the past was being reevaluated, surrounding yourself with fern patterns was like wrapping yourself in a blanket of natural order. The fern publishers produced another category of book, the fern album. These were blank albums, specially designed with heavy pages for mounting pressed specimens. They often came with decorative covers, ferns embossed on leather and printed labels for cataloging specimens. Families would fill these albums over years of collecting. Each Sunday's expedition would add new specimens. Each vacation to a different part of the country would yield new species. The album became a record of time spent, places visited, knowledge accumulated. These albums were treasured objects, handled carefully, displayed prominently. Visitors would be invited to look through them, and the owner would narrate each specimen. This one from the Lake District. 1858. Rather a wet day, but we found a lovely patch of beach ferns growing near the old mill. This one from Scotland, 1860. A rare variety. Notice the unusual serration.et. The album was a story. Each fern was a chapter. The whole book was an autobiography, told not in words but in pressed fronds, in dates and locations. In the accumulated evidence of attention paid to the natural world, children learned to press ferns, to mount them in albums, to write the labels in careful script. It was education teaching them botany, taxonomy, patience, careful handwork, but it was also enculturation, teaching them to value the things Victorian society valued: nature, order, systematic knowledge, the proper use of leisure time. The commercial success of fern-related products was remarkable. Nurseries specialized in ferns made fortunes. Publishers of fern books saw multiple editions sell out. Wallpaper manufacturers couldn't produce fern patterns fast enough. This was consumer culture in its Victorian form, not yet the mass consumption of the 20th century, but definitely the beginning of it. People were buying things not because they needed them, but because they wanted to participate in a cultural phenomenon. Because owning fern-patterned goods signaled membership in a community of taste. Marketing, as we'd now call it, was developing. Advertisements in magazines targeted fern enthusiasts specifically. For the discerning Pterido, the ads would begin. Then offer some new product, a specialized potting mix, an improved Wardian case design, a newly imported exotic species. The advertisers understood that fern mania wasn't just about plants. It was about identity, about being a certain kind of person, educated, refined, connected to nature, scientifically curious, tasteful. By this product, the ads implied. And you're not just buying a Wardian case or a book or a piece of wallpaper. You're buying membership in that identity. The evening light fades. The room we've been imagining papered with ferns, furnished with fern-patterned fabrics, decorated with fern art, grows dim. The patterns recede into shadow, become less distinct. More suggestion than specific form, but they're still there, surrounding the inhabitants, creating an environment that's been carefully constructed to reflect and reinforce their values, their interests, their sense of who they are. Tomorrow, new fern products will be advertised in the morning papers. New books will arrive at bookshops. New patterns will be displayed in fabric stores. The industrial production of fern imagery will continue, feeding the obsession, keeping it alive, making it accessible to ever wider audiences, until ferns have moved from hobby to aesthetic to industry, from private passion to mass culture, from the thing itself to its endless reproduction in every medium. Victorian technology can manage the pattern, repeats and repeats and repeats. The train lurches to a stop at a small country station. It's a Saturday morning in July 1868. And the platform is crowded with people disembarking, not locals, but visitors from London and other cities, identifiable by their clothes, their accents, their excitement. They're carrying baskets and trowels, wearing practical boots and rain capes. They've come for the ferns. This particular station, serving a village in the Lake District, has become unexpectedly popular. The reason, a recent article in the Fern Gazette reported that rare varieties of shield fern have been spotted growing on the rocky slopes near a waterfall 2 miles north of the village, so they've come. Dozens of them. On the weekend trains, clutching their copies of illustrated fern guides, ready to search. This is fern hunting at its peak. Not quiet Sunday strolls by local enthusiasts anymore, but organized expeditions. Tourism driven by botanical passion. Let's follow one of these groups as they set out from the village into the hills. There are 8 of them, 2 families traveling together. Their children ranging from 6 to 15. The fathers are clerk and teacher respectively. The mothers managing the logistics of lunch baskets and spare clothing. Everyone is in good spirits, anticipating the adventure ahead. The path leads upward out of the village, through fields where sheep graze, then into rougher country rocky slopes covered with bracken and heather. Scattered trees bent by constant wind. The air grows cooler as they climb. They can hear water in the distance, sound of the waterfall they're seeking. The children run ahead, then back, full of energy. The adults talk as they walk about ferns, of course, but also about their lives back in the city, about the relief of being in open country, about how good the air smells here compared to London's coal-thick atmosphere. One of the mothers is an accomplished botanist, more knowledgeable than her husband, though she'd never claim expertise so directly. She's the one who spotted the article about the shield ferns, who organized this expedition, who knows exactly what to look for as they near the waterfall. She calls for everyone to slow down, to look carefully. The shield ferns prefer very damp conditions, she explains. Look for them growing near the water, in the spray zone. They'll be on rocks, probably, or in the moss between rocks. The group spreads out, searching. The sound of falling water is loud now, filling the air with constant soothing noise. The rocks are slick with spray, rainbows forming and dissolving in the mist. And there, yes, there, growing on a boulder, perpetually wet from spray, a cluster of ferns with distinctive shield-shaped sorry patterns on the undersides of their fronds. Asterisk. Polystechum aculeatum. Asterisk, the hard shield fern, not the absolute rarest species, but uncommon enough to be exciting, and this is a particularly fine specimen. Large and perfectly formed, the knowledgeable mother examines it carefully with her magnifying glass, confirms the identification, then faces a decision that every fern collector must make, to dig or not to dig. Victorian fern hunting existed in tension with Victorian conservation ethics, though conservation, in the modern sense, didn't quite exist yet. There was a growing awareness that over-harvesting could deplete wild populations. But there was also a collecting culture that measured success by possession. By how many species you could acquire for your personal collection, she decides to take a small piece, not the whole plant, which would be greedy and potentially harmful to the population, but a few fronds and a portion of the root system. If she's careful, if she tends it properly, she can grow this into a healthy specimen for her Wardian case. While leaving the parent plant intact to continue growing, her husband does the digging, the physical labor. Even in botanical pursuits, remains divided along gendered lines. He's careful, following her instructions, taking only what she indicates, ensuring the remaining plant isn't too disturbed. The specimen is wrapped in damp moss, placed in one of their collection baskets. They mark the location in their notebook for future reference, and then they continue exploring. The children have been searching too, and they found common polypody growing on a fallen log, bracken everywhere, of course, and several other common species. Each find is examined, identified, using the illustrated guide one family has brought. Discussed, even common species are exciting to the children who are still learning. The youngest daughter has developed a particular interest in the patterns of sorry on the underside of fronds. She lies on the damp ground, heedless of her dress getting muddy. examining each fern with intense focus. "Look how regular they are," she exclaims, "like someone arranged them with a ruler." Her mother smiles. This is exactly why they bring the children on these expeditions, to cultivate this kind of observation. This wonder at natural order. These skills, this attention, will serve the daughter well. Even though as a woman, she'll have limited opportunities for formal scientific education, they picnic beside the waterfall, eating bread and cheese and fruit, drinking cold tea from a thermos. The conversation drifts from ferns to other topics, politics, literature. The question of whether they'll extend their stay in the Lake District for another day. But it returns to ferns. It always returns to ferns. One of the fathers mentions a lecture he attended about fern fossils found in coal seams, about the immense forests of tree ferns that covered the earth millions of years ago. "Imagine," he says, "ferns 40 feet tall, forests of them, and no flowering plants at all. A completely different world." They try to imagine it. The children especially are captivated by the idea, world of giant ferns, of the plants they're collecting today, but transformed into trees, dominating landscapes that would eventually compress into the coal that fuels the factories they're trying to escape for the weekend. It's dizzying, the sense of deep time. This realization that ferns connect present to past, that studying them is touching something ancient. The afternoon passes. They explore further, finding several more notable specimens. Lady fern with particularly elegant fronds, a heartstung, growing in a shaded crevice. They take modest samples, make detailed notes. By late afternoon, they're tired. The baskets are heavier now, filled with damp moss and wrapped fern roots. They've walked perhaps 6 miles, much of it uphill on rough terrain. They return to the village, catch the evening train back to their temporary lodgings in a nearby town. Tomorrow, they'll explore different sites, following tips from other collectors they've met, chasing reports of rare varieties. This is Victorian tourism, not the passive sightseeing of later eras, but active, purposeful, driven by collecting passion. The Lake District, the Scottish Highlands, the Welsh Mountains, the rocky coasts of Devon and Cornwall all became destinations for fern hunters, developing small industries catering to these visiting enthusiasts. Local guides offered their services, claiming knowledge of secret fern locations. Inns advertised convenient accommodations for botanical parties. Some landowners charged admission to particularly rich fern sites on their property. The railroad companies, always looking for reasons to sell tickets, promoted these destinations in their advertising. Visit the Fern Havens of Scotland. A poster might proclaim, featuring an idealized illustration of ferny cliffs and waterfalls. Not everyone approved. Some locals resented the invasion of city folk tramping through the countryside, digging up plants. There were complaints about damage to sites, about collectors taking too much, leaving nothing for others. Some popular fern locations became genuinely depleted. Rare varieties that had been reported would be completely dug up within a season, as enthusiasts descended to claim specimens. The very act of publishing locations in fern journals created its own problem, directing collectors to vulnerable populations. There were calls for restraint, for collecting ethics, for leaving some specimens undisturbed. Some enthusiasts advocated for propagating ferns from spores, rather than digging up wild plants, for trading propagated specimens rather than wild collected ones. But enforcement was impossible. The culture of collection, of proving your dedication through possession of rare specimens, is powerful. The train rocks gently as it carries our fern hunters back through the summer evening. They're exhausted, but satisfied. They've successfully collected several new species. They've spent the day outdoors in beautiful country. They've shared their passion with fellow enthusiasts and taught their children to observe and appreciate nature. Tomorrow, the collected ferns will need attention, potting, placement in Wardian cases, initial care while they adjust to captivity. Some may not survive the transition. Ferns can be finicky, and moving them from wild conditions to domestic cultivation is always a risk. But that's tomorrow's concern. Tonight, tired and content, they watch the countryside pass outside the train. Windows, the hills darkening as the sun sets, and they talk about next week's expedition. Because fern hunting is addictive. The search, the discovery, the careful collection. It's a sense of bringing home treasure. These create a cycle that's hard to break. And when you have friends who share the obsession, when you can plan expeditions together, when you can compare finds and trade specimens, and discuss the relative merits of different collecting sites, the hobby becomes a lifestyle. The landscape rolls past. The train chugs toward the town, the basket at their feet wrapped in damp moss. The shield fern begins its journey from wild to domestic. It's from waterfall rock to Wardian case, from nature to collection. One more specimen. In one more collection, multiplied by thousands of collectors across Britain, slowly moving ferns from their native habitats into parlors and conservatories, transforming wild populations into arranged displays, turning nature into culture. The train whistle sounds. The station approaches. The fern hunters gather their belongings, prepare to disembark, already planning tomorrow's adventure. The hunt continues. By 1870, Pteridomania has reached extraordinary heights. This is the moment of peak obsession, when ferns have moved beyond hobby into cultural phenomenon, when the mania truly earns its name. Let's measure it in numbers first. The cold data that underlies passion: fern nurseries across Britain, over 100 specialized businesses, some with inventories of thousands of plants. One prominent London nursery advertises 847 varieties of ferns for sale, including rare species priced at several pounds each. A significant sum when a clerk might earn £2 per week. Fern societies and clubs, at least 24 formal organizations, from the prestigious London Pteridological Society to small regional clubs meeting in church halls and private homes. Combined membership in the thousands. Books published on British ferns in the 1860s, more than 30 titles, ranging from expensive scientific works to cheap popular guides. Total copies sold, tens of thousands. Articles on ferns in periodicals and newspapers, appearing weekly, sometimes daily. The popular press runs features on Fern Fever and the fern craze, treating it as a social phenomenon worth documenting. But numbers can't capture the texture of the obsession, the way it permeates daily life for those caught up in it. Let's visit a meeting of the Kensington Fern Society, held on a Thursday evening in March 1871. The room is crowded, perhaps 40 people. It's far more than the organizers expected. They're mostly middle class, mostly but not entirely male. Several women attend, either with their husbands or in pairs. Respectable spinsters whose botanical knowledge rivals or exceeds the men's, but whose participation must be carefully negotiated within Victorian gender proprieties. The president of the society, retired military officer who discovered ferns after returning from India, and now pursues them with the same intensity he once devoted to military campaigns, calls the meeting to order. First, presentations of newly acquired specimens. Several members have brought ferns to show, carrying them carefully in cloth-covered cases. Each presentation follows a ritual format. The presenter explains where and when the specimen was acquired, identifies it by Latin name, and describes any notable characteristics: unusual coloring, unexpected vigor, distinctive sori patterns. The audience examines each specimen closely, asking questions, occasionally disputing identifications. These disputes can become heated. Taxonomic disagreements among amateur naturalists are serious business. One member presents what he claims is a new variety of lady fern, with fronds divided in an unusual pattern. He's given it a name: Ethereum filix femina, var. Kensington, after the society itself. If other pteridologists accept the identification, if the variety proves stable when propagated, its name will be attached to it in future botanical literature. This is powerful motivation. Amateur naturalists in this era can still make real contributions to scientific knowledge. The gap between professional and amateur science hasn't yet widened into the chasm it will become in the 20th century. Enthusiasts with no formal training but sharp observation skills can discover varieties, document patterns, contribute data that professionals value. After presentations, a lecture. Tonight's speaker is a university botanist who studied fern reproduction in detail. He's brought illustrations, large drawings that he displays on an easel, showing the structures involved in the complex fern life cycle. The audience is rapt. Even though most of them have heard versions of this lecture before, the mystery of fern reproduction remains endlessly fascinating. The speaker describes the protheless stage, the swimming sperm, the fertilization process. He passes around glass slides showing microscopic structures. Let's audience members look through his scientific microscope. Questions follow. Detailed, technical questions about spore viability and fertilization, success rates, and weather ferns.
Might hybridize between species.
The speaker answers carefully, honestly acknowledging when scientific knowledge is incomplete. Then, the business portion of the meeting. The treasurer reports on the society's finances due thus collected, expenses for room rental and refreshments. The librarian announces new acquisitions for the society's collection of fern literature. The expedition coordinator discusses plans for the spring collecting season. This is important. The society organizes group expeditions, pooling resources to travel to prime fern locations. They're planning a week-long trip to Wales in May, targeting several sites known for rare species. 20 members have already committed to going. These expeditions combine botanical collecting with social bonding. They're part scientific expedition, part holiday, part pilgrimage. Evenings are spent comparing the day's finds, discussing identification challenges, drinking beer, and singing songs, some of which, increasingly, are fern-themed parodies of popular tunes. Finally, the social hour. Tea and biscuits are served. Members circulate, trading specimens and cuttings, sharing tips on cultivation, catching up on gossip. The gossip is often about other collectors who's acquired what rare species, paid an exorbitant price for a specimen that turned out to be misidentified, who's developed a particularly fine display in their conservatory. There's competition here, though it's expressed politely. Collectors compare the size of their collections, the rarity of their specimens, the quality of their cultivation. Some people are clearly more passionate than others, more knowledgeable, more successful. A hierarchy has developed, with the most dedicated and successful collectors earning respect and social status within the community. 4 people, whose daily lives offer limited opportunities for distinction clerks and teachers and shopkeepers, who will never be wealthy or famous. This micro-community offers a chance to be important, to be respected for expertise and dedication rather than birth or income. It's democratizing in its way. Your rank in the fern community depends on your knowledge and your collection, not your accent or your address. The meeting concludes. People gather their belongings, their specimens, their new cuttings received in trade. They file out into the March evening, heading home through gaslit streets. Some will stop at a pub for a final pint and more fern talk. Others head directly home, eager to pot their new acquisitions, to check on existing specimens, to make notes in their collection catalogs. This meeting with its presentations and lecture and social hours repeating in variations all across Britain, in Edinburgh and Manchester, in Bristol and Birmingham, in small towns where half a dozen enthusiasts gather in someone's parlor, the same rituals are being enacted. Pteridomania has become organized, institutionalized. It has structures and hierarchies, rules and traditions. It has, in short, become a subculture or world within the larger world, with its own values and status markers, its own language and practices. For those deeply embedded in this subculture, ferns aren't just a hobby. They're a lens through which life is experienced. Vacations are planned around fern collecting opportunities. This created incentive for commercial collectors who harvested ferns specifically to sell, caring nothing for conservation, only for profit. These commercial collectors were the most destructive, systematically stripping sites, selling to the highest bidders. Amateur collectors often looked down on them, seeing them as mercenary, lacking the true appreciation that motivated genteel collecting. But the distinction was perhaps smaller than anyone wanted to admit. Whether you harvested for love or money, the fern was still removed, population still depleted, the hillside and the lake. District sits bare. Mr. Thompson's filmy fern struggles in its terrarium. Somewhere, a nursery sells another rare specimen to an eager collector who promises to care for it properly, who believes they're helping preserve the species, and the slow erosion continues. Invisible, except in aggregate, noticed only by those who remember how it used to be. How abundant these plants once were before the mania took hold. This is the paradox at the heart of Pteridomania. The love was genuine. The harm was real, and both things are true simultaneously. The collectors weren't lying when they said they loved ferns. They did. Deeply. Obsessively. Truly. But they loved them in a particular way, possessive way. A way that required ownership and display. That couldn't be satisfied by simply observing, by leaving beautiful things alone. And that kind of love, multiplied by thousands, proved unsustainable. The costs were paid by the landscapes, by the depleted populations, by the bare rocks where abundance once grew, and perhaps also by the collectors themselves. Though they couldn't quite see at the cost of obsession that consumes perspective, that transforms wonder into acquisitiveness, that mistakes possession for appreciation. The evening falls on the bare hillside. The rocks grow cold. The moss, at least, remains in parlors across Britain, in Wardian cases, and on windowsills. Ferns grow behind glass, displaced, preserved, admired, safe, perhaps, but also captive. And the wild places they came from grow a little emptier with each passing season. Every obsession has its arc-ignition, escalation, peak, and then, inevitably, decline. By 1880, Pteridomania is beginning to fade. Not disappearing, exactly. People still collect ferns, still join fern societies, still publish articles and books, but the intensity is lessening. The mania is becoming something milder, more sustainable, it's less all-consuming. Let's observe this transition through a particular Wardian case in a particular parlor. The case is dusty. Not filthy, the household is still respectable, still maintains standards, but no longer spotless. It's been weeks since anyone carefully cleaned the glass panels, removed the dust that accumulates despite best efforts. Inside, the ferns are overgrown. Some specimens have crowded out others. Dead fronds haven't been removed promptly. The careful arrangement that once characterized the display has given way to something more chaotic, less curated. The lady of the house notices this, feels vaguely guilty about it. She remembers when she checked the Wardian case daily, when adjusting its contents was a major weekly ritual, when she could name every specimen by Latin binomial and recite where and when each was collected, but other interests have arisen. Her oldest daughter is learning piano seriously now, and the lessons and practice absorb time and attention. Her husband has become involved in local politics, and their parlor now hosts political discussion groups rather than fern society meetings. The ferns remain, but they're no longer the center of the household's attention. They've become background, decoration. A reminder of an earlier enthusiasm that never quite died, but definitely diminished. This scene is repeating across Britain. The obsession is easing. The mania is becoming normalcy. Several factors drive this decline. First, exhaustion. Any passion maintained at peak intensity will eventually burn out. By 1880, the most enthusiastic collectors have been hunting ferns for 20 years or more. They've collected every species accessible to them. They've read all the books, attended all the lectures, joined all the societies. The hobby has become routine, and routine is the enemy of obsession. Second, depletion. The easiest to reach populations of rare ferns are gone, collected out. What remains requires more effort to find, more travel to access. The law of diminishing returns applies. Each new acquisition requires increasing effort for decreasing reward. Third, fashion. The Victorian era is nothing if not susceptible to changing fashions. And by 1880, new botanical interests are arising. Orchids are becoming the fashionable plant to collect exotic. It's difficult to cultivate, more visibly spectacular than ferns. Some former fern enthusiasts transfer their passion to orchids, finding in them novelty that ferns no longer provide. Fourth, distraction. The world is moving on. New concerns, a rise of political changes, economic depressions, the growing Irish question, imperial anxieties. The comfortable mid-Victorian certainty that made fern collecting feel important is fragmenting. People have other things to worry about. Fifth, generational change. The children raised in fern-obsessed households don't necessarily share their parents' passion. They've seen the Wardian cases their entire lives. To them, ferns are just furniture, not fascinating discoveries. The intense enthusiasm doesn't transmit automatically to the next generation. The institutions built during the mania's peak began to struggle. Fern societies find membership declining. Meetings that once overflowed now struggle to achieve quorum. The energetic discussions of earlier years give way to smaller groups of diehards, maintaining tradition more than pursuing passion. Some societies fold entirely. Others merge or become subgroups of more general botanical societies. The infrastructure that supported Pteridomania, the specialized journals, the dedicated nurseries, the guidebooks, begins to contract. This isn't catastrophic decline. It's gradual, almost gentle, like the mania itself. The fate is very British plight, understated, never quite acknowledged directly. Let's visit one final Fern Society meeting. In 1883, 12 people attend, down from the 40 or 50 who came in the peak years. They're older now. These remaining enthusiasts, the keen young collectors of the 1860s, are middle-aged or elderly in the 1880s, and young people aren't replacing them in the same numbers. The meeting follows the traditional format, but it feels like performance now. Like maintaining tradition for tradition's sake, rather than because the passion demands it. One member presents a specimen not newly collected, but a cultivated variety he's been growing for several years, which has finally produced an interesting sport, a spontaneous mutation. The presentation is dutiful, but lacks the excitement it might have generated a decade earlier. The lecture tonight concerns fern fossils and interesting topic, but delivered to a small, tired audience that's heard similar lectures multiple times before. During the social hour, conversation drifts away from ferns more easily than it once did. People discuss their children, their work, politics, the weather. Ferns remain part of the conversation, but no longer dominate it completely. The treasurer reports that the society is financially stable, but seeing declining dues income as membership shrinks. A discussion ensues about whether to reduce meeting frequency from monthly to quarterly. The decision is postponed, but everyone senses it's coming. These remaining enthusiasts are the diehards, people for whom fern collecting became too central to abandon easily. They'll maintain their collections, continue their studies, keep the societies alive as long as possible, but they know something has changed. The vitality is gone. The momentum has shifted. One elderly member, who's been collecting since the 1840s, remembers the early days when fern societies were new and exciting, when every meeting brought discoveries, when the future of pteridology seemed limitless. He doesn't say this aloud, it would sound like complaint, like nostalgia, but he thinks it. And others probably think it too. The fashion for fern-patterned wallpapers and fabrics declined similarly. By the mid-1880s, home decoration is moving toward other motifs. Ferns remain available, but are no longer dominant. The saturation has created backlash. People want something fresh, less ubiquitous. Some households update their decor, placing fern wallpapers with more fashionable patterns. The Wardian cases remain, but are gradually relegated to less prominent positions. Move from the parlor to the conservatory or back hall. Still present, but no longer central. In used furniture shops and estate sales. Wardian cases appear with increasing frequency. Some are bought by continuing enthusiasts looking to expand their displays. Others are purchased for other uses as storage for non-botanical items, as decorative objects valued for their craftsmanship rather than their original purpose. The fern albums, lovingly compiled over decades, are relegated to shelves, consulted less frequently. Eventually, some are disposed of by heirs who don't understand their significance, who see them as relics of an incomprehensible obsession, who clear them out while settling estates. Decades later, Historians will recover some of these albums from attics and archives, recognizing their value as documentation of both Victorian botany and Victorian culture. But in the 1880s and 1890s, as the mania fades, they're just old books full of dried plants, kept out of sentiment but no longer actively engaging anyone's passion. Reading material consists of fern books and pteridological journals. Social life revolves around fern societies and fellow collectors. Disposable income goes to rare specimens in new Wardian cases. Some families organize their entire domestic space around fern cultivation. They build conservatories, invest in specialized equipment, hire gardeners knowledgeable about fern care. The line between enthusiast and obsessive blurs and sometimes disappears entirely. There are stories probably exaggerated, but believed of collectors who've bankrupted themselves pursuing rare specimens, who've neglected their businesses or professional duties for fern hunting, who've alienated family members who don't share their passion. These cautionary tales are told with a mixture of judgment and admiration. Because even as Victorians recognize that obsession can be unhealthy, they also romanticize it. The dedicated collector becomes a kind of hero in these stories, someone who commits fully to a passion, who pursues beauty and knowledge with single-minded intensity. The peak of any mania contains the seeds of its decline. When something becomes too popular, too widespread, it begins to lose its distinctiveness. When every middle-class parlor has a Wardian case, when every wallpaper features fern patterns, when every Sunday sees crowds of collectors tramping through the countryside, the hobby stops being special. But we're not quite there yet. In 1871, at the peak, the mania still feels vital, exciting, important. The attendees of the Kensington Fern Society meeting head home through the dark streets, and each of them feels part of something larger than themselves. Something meaningful. They are pteridologists. They are naturalists. They are participants in the grand Victorian project of understanding and cataloging the natural world, and they are collectors. Possessors of beautiful things, curators of miniature green worlds that exist behind glass, needing nothing but their attention to survive, the madness at its peak. Feels like sanity. Feels like the only reasonable response to a world that's changing too fast. That's losing its connection to nature, that threatens to become all smoke and noise and mechanical chaos. The ferns. In their Wardian cases, in their grottos, in their carefully pressed albums, are refuges and madness, perhaps, is just another word for devotion taken to its logical conclusion. The meeting is over. The lights are extinguished. The building empties. But the obsession continues. In 40 homes scattered across London, in hundreds of homes across Britain, in thousands of private moments when someone checks on a cherished fern, waters it carefully, examines new growth with quiet satisfaction, the gentle madness peaks, and for now, for this moment, it feels eternal. There's a hillside in the Lake District, where heart-stung ferns once grew in such profusion that the rocks seemed draped in green ribbons. By 1875, they're gone, completely harvested. The rocks are bare except for moss and lichen. Let's sit on these rocks for a moment, in this absence, and consider what's been lost. This is the part of the story we've been approaching. The shadow beneath the enthusiasm, because every obsession has consequences. And Pteridomania's consequences were written on landscapes across Britain in the language of depletion. The problem was simple. Ferns don't reproduce quickly. A flowering plant can scatter hundreds of seeds in a season, some of which will germinate, producing new plants within months. But ferns grow slowly from spores, and the process is fragile. A fern population takes years, sometimes decades, to establish in a particular microhabitat, and collectors, in their thousands, were harvesting faster than populations could recover. Rare species became rarer. Some disappeared entirely from their known locations. Sites mentioned in early fern guides became barren, picked clean by successive waves of enthusiasts. Following published directions to prime collecting spots, the Victorian naturalists weren't blind to this. Articles began appearing in journals, urging restraint, proposing collection ethics. Some prominent collectors publicly renounced wild collecting, committed to propagating ferns from spores instead. But the culture of collecting, of possession, of completionism, of having every species, every variety was powerful. And there was no enforcement mechanism. No one could prevent a collector from digging up an entire rare fern if they chose to. Some collectors justified themselves by claiming they were rescuing ferns, preserving them in cultivation where they'd be safe from habitat destruction. And this wasn't entirely wrong. The Victorian era saw massive landscape changes as industry and agriculture expanded. Ferns in Wardian cases might indeed survive longer than ferns in the wild in some cases, but mostly, this was rationalization. Collectors wanted specimens. The desire to possess overrode conservation concerns. Let's follow one particular collectora, gentleman we'll call Mr. Thompson. Though he could be any of hundreds of serious enthusiasts, Mr. Thompson is walking through a Scottish GA ravine in 1876. He's heard reports of a rare filmy fern species growing here, and he's determined to find it. He's traveled 2 days by train for this opportunity. He finds it, a patch of incredibly delicate ferns, growing on damp rock in a perpetually shaded spot. Their fronds so thin, they're translucent, like green tissue paper. Hymenophyllum wilsoni, the Wilson's filmy fern. Genuinely rare, genuinely beautiful. He knows intellectually that he should leave it undisturbed. He's read the articles about over-collecting. He considers himself a responsible naturalist, but he's traveled so far, and it would be just one specimen. And he doesn't have this species in his collection yet, and who knows if he'll ever have another opportunity? He begins to dig. The rationalization comes easily. Asterisk, someone else will take it if I don't. I'll care for it properly. I'll propagate it from spores and eventually restore populations. I'm not hurting anything. The clump is large. I'm only taking a small piece. Asterisk, he carefully extracts a portion of the plant, roots and all, wraps it in damp moss, places it in his collecting tin, and moves on, searching for other specimens, other rarities to complete his collection. This scene, repeated thousands of times by thousands of collectors across hundreds of sites, created cumulative impact that no single collector intended or recognized. Each person taking just one specimen, just a small piece, just this once. Each person sure that their individual action couldn't possibly matter, couldn't possibly make a difference, but it did. Collectively, it did. By the late 1870s, several formerly common species had become genuinely rare in the wild. Some varieties vanished entirely, existing only in the cultivated collections where they'd been preserved. The irony is painful. The obsessive love of ferns led directly to their depletion. The very passion that drove collectors to appreciate and study these plants also drove them to harvest unsustainably. There were other costs too. Less tangible, but real. The cost to families whose members became so absorbed in fern collecting that other obligations suffered. Husbands who spent household money on rare specimens instead of necessities. Women who neglected domestic duties for botanical expeditions. Children raised in homes where ferns receive more attention than people. These stories exist in the margins of the historical record, hints in letters, complaints in diaries. Occasional mentions in periodicals that ran satirical pieces about fern widows and obsessed collectors. Most collectors maintain balance. Of course, for most people, ferns were an enhancement to life, not a replacement for it. But for some, the obsession became genuinely destructive. There's melancholy in this. Because the collectors weren't villains. They were people pursuing beauty, seeking connection with nature, finding meaning and community through a shared passion. Their intentions were good. Their love was real. But love without wisdom can be destructive. Passion without restraint can consume what it claims to cherish. Mr. Thompson returns home with his filmy fern. He pots it carefully in a terrarium designed specifically for species requiring high humidity. He tends it devotedly. He notes its progress in his collection catalog. The plant survives barely. Filmy ferns are notoriously difficult to cultivate, but he counts it as a success. He has it. He's preserved it. added it to his collection. Back in the Scottish ravine, the remaining filmy ferns are a little less numerous, a little more vulnerable. The next collector who finds them will take another piece. And the next. And the next, within 5 years, they'll be gone from that location entirely. There were attempts at institutional response. Some botanical gardens began propagation programs, trying to reduce pressure on wild populations by making cultivated specimens available. Some local authorities attempted to restrict collecting on certain sites, though enforcement was difficult. The journals that had promoted fern hunting began running articles urging restraint. The true terreologist, one article argued, values observation over possession. One can appreciate and study ferns without removing them from their native habitats. But changing collector culture was like trying to turn a ship slow, difficult, requiring more coordinated effort than the community could muster. And there was always the economic incentive. Nurseries selling rare ferns, guides offering to lead collectors to prime sites, landowners charging access fees to fern locations all had, financial reasons to encourage continued collecting. The market for rare specimens remained strong. Some collectors would pay extraordinary prices for unusual varieties. This is the melancholy of any cultural phenomenon's decline. Not dramatic collapse, but slow diminishment. It's not rejection, but gentle forgetting. Not ending, but fading into quietness. Of course, continue growing. In Wardian cases less carefully maintained, in conservatories where attention has moved to other plants, and now in fashionable fern grottos slowly being reconceived as rose gardens. The ferns persist. They're survivors after all. That's what ferns do. They outlast fashions, outlive their admirers. Continue the ancient cycles of growth and reproduction regardless of human interest. Some wild populations, given decades of reduced collection pressure, begin recovering. The depleted hillsides start showing green again as spores take hold and new plants establish. The recovery is slow, ferns. Don't hurry, but it happens. By 1890, Pteridomania is remembered more than experienced. Older people might say, oh yes, the fern craze. Remember when everyone was mad for ferns? And younger people might be mildly surprised that something so seemingly innocuous could ever have generated such passion. But the evidence remains. Embedded in the material culture of late Victorian Britain, the Wardian cases gathering dust in conservatories, the pressed specimens in albums. The fern motifs still visible on aging wallpapers and fabrics. The specialized books accumulating gently on library shelves and in the memories of those who were caught up in it, who spent their Sundays hunting ferns, their evenings tending collections, their social lives engaging with fellow enthusiasts. For them, even as passion fades, the memories remain of damp forests and careful excavations, of the thrill of discovery and the satisfaction of successful cultivation, of belonging to a community united by shared enthusiasm. The mania may have faded, but it changed them, taught them to observe closely, to value beauty in small things, to find meaning in patient attention, and that, perhaps, is what outlasts the obsession itself, not the collections or the societies, but the way of seeing, the habit of attention. The learned capacity for wonder, the parlor darkens. The dusty Wardian case fades into evening shadow. The ferns inside continue their slow growth, indifferent to being observed or ignored. The obsession is past. The plants remain, and time, patient as any fern, moves forward. Walk through a Victorian neighborhood today. You can find one that survived modernization and look closely at the architecture there. In the ironwork of a fence, fern fronds cast in metal, repeating patterns frozen in black iron. There, above a doorway, carved stone ferns decorating the lintel, barely visible now under a century of weathering there. In the tiling of an entryway, ceramic ferns arranged in mosaic. Their colors faded, but patterns still distinct. The Victorians built their obsession into their buildings. And those buildings remain, silent testaments to a moment when ferns mattered intensely enough to be immortalized in architecture. This is what outlasts mania, the passion itself, which fades, but the marks it leaves on the world, the physical residue of cultural enthusiasm, embedded in materials more durable than memory. Let's trace these legacies, moving from the concrete to the conceptual, from the material remains to the influence on how we think and see. The most visible legacy is architectural. Victorian Gothic revival and arts and crafts movements both embraced fern motifs extensively. Designers saw in ferns the perfect combination of natural beauty and mathematical order, organic forms that nonetheless followed regular patterns. Great Victorian glass houses, conservatories and winter gardens built in cities across Britain often featured fern houses as dedicated spaces. Some of these structures survive today, restored and maintained as historical monuments. Visit them, and you're walking through spaces designed around fern cultivation, experiencing directly the architectural expression of Pteridomania. The Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, outside London, still maintains Victorian-era fern collections in period glass houses. The structure itself is a legacy built to house ferns when the mania was at its height. Preserved now as both botanical garden and architectural heritage. Smaller examples exist too. Private homes built during the Victorian era often include design elements inspired by ferns, carved woodwork, etched glass, decorative plasterwork. These details are easy to overlook, faded into background, but once you start noticing, you see them everywhere. Then there's the legacy in collections. Many Victorian fern collections, maintained with such devotion during the mania, eventually found their way to botanical institutions. The pressed specimens in their albums became teaching collections, research materials, historical documentation of Victorian botany. Modern botanists, studying fern distribution and variation, sometimes consult these Victorian collections, using them as historical baselines to understand how populations have changed over the past century and a half. Some of the species variations, Victorian collectors identified the sports and mutations they named and propagated, still exist in cultivation today, maintained by specialized nurseries and botanical gardens. These cultivars are direct descendants of individual plants collected 150 years ago, living links to the mania. The Wardian case itself became a permanent part of horticultural technology. Modern terrariums are direct descendants of Dr. Ward's accidental invention. The principles haven't changed. Glass containers creating controlled microclimates for plant cultivation. Though the fashion for elaborate Victorian-style Wardian cases faded, the technology persisted, adapted, evolved. Today you can buy terrariums in any garden center. Most people who own them have no idea they're using technology developed during and because of Victorian fern mania. The heritage is invisible, but real. There's cultural legacy too. Harder to quantify, but perhaps more profound. Pteridomania was among the first mass participation hobbies in the modern sense-organized clubs, specialized publications, commercial infrastructure catering to enthusiasts. It established patterns that would be repeated with other collecting manias, the enthusiast societies, the conventions and meetings, the graduated hierarchy of casual participants to devoted experts. Contemporary hobby culture, whether it's collectors of vinyl records or action figures, enthusiasts of craft beer or vintage motorcycles, follows structures first, established by Victorian fern collectors and their contemporaries. The idea that ordinary people could contribute to scientific knowledge through careful amateur observation was promoted and validated by fern collecting. While this tradition has roots extending further back, Pteridomania helped democratize it. Showed that you didn't need university affiliation or wealthy patronage to study nature meaningfully. This legacy continued into modern citizen science programs, which rely on volunteers to collect data about everything from bird populations to plant distributions. The Victorian fern collector, noting where and when they found species, recording observations in careful notebooks, established a template that persists in how we think about amateur naturalism. There's also the legacy of conservation awareness. The depletion of wild fern populations during the mania helped inspire early thinking about conservation ethics, about sustainable collecting practices, about the need to preserve wild populations even when collection is possible. the debates Victorian pteridologists had about collecting ethics, about whether to take specimens or only observe, about how to balance desire for possession with responsibility for preservation, foreshadowed modern conservation discussions. Many of the arguments used today to justify sustainable use of natural resources, to promote observation over collection, to restrict access to vulnerable species. These arguments were first articulated by Victorian fern enthusiasts confronting the consequences of their own passion. In that sense, Pteridomania taught important lessons about the tensions between appreciation and exploitation, between love of nature and possession of nature, between individual desire and collective responsibility. These lessons weren't fully learned in the Victorian-era conservation biology was still decades away from becoming a formal discipline, but the seeds were planted. Walk through a modern botanical garden and you'll see ferns. Not because they're fashionable, they're not, particularly, but because Victorian collectors established them as standard components of botanical collections. The diversity of ferns cultivated today, the expertise in their care, the breeding of new cultivars all build on foundations laid during Pteridomania. Some botanical institutions maintain Victorian-era fern collections as historical specimens, carefully preserving these plants as living heritage, connections to the collectors who first cultivated them. There's something moving about this. Ferns that were collected in the 1860s, potted by Victorian hands, tended through generations of cultivation, still growing in institutional collections today. They're among the oldest continuously maintained horticultural specimens in existence. They've outlived their collectors, outlived the mania that brought them into cultivation, outlived the entire Victorian era itself. But they're still here, still growing, still unfurling new fronds each spring in the patient way ferns have. If you visit old cemeteries in Britain, you'll sometimes find graves decorated with fern motifs carved on headstones, planted as grave borders. Victorians brought their love of ferns even into death, used them as symbols of remembrance and eternity. Some of those planted ferns still grow, tended by no one, surviving through their own hardiness, descendants of memorial plantings that outlasted memory itself. In literature, too, there's legacy. Victorian novels and poetry often reference ferns, using them as symbols with meanings contemporary readers would have immediately understood but modern readers miss without context. When a Victorian novelist describes a character pressing ferns into a book, or arranging a fern display, or walking forest paths searching for specimens, these details carry symbolic weight signaling class status, gender dynamics, scientific literacy, romantic intention that only makes sense knowing about Pteridomania. Modern readers of Victorian literature rediscover these references, puzzle over them, research them, gradually understanding how deeply ferns were woven into Victorian culture. The legacy exists in language too. Phrases like Fern Fever and fern madness entered Victorian vocabulary and occasionally resurface in modern discussions of collecting mania, applied metaphorically to contemporary enthusiasms. We speak of Bitcoin mania, tulip mania, housing bubble mania. We understand how irrational passions can grip populations, how the extraordinary can become normalized, how mass psychology creates phenomena that seem absurd in retrospect but were intensely real to participants. Pteridomania gives us a template for understanding these dynamics, a historical case study in how cultural enthusiasms emerge, peak, fade. And perhaps that's the deepest legacy, not the ferns themselves, not the collections or buildings or societies, but the story. The narrative of how ordinary people became extraordinarily passionate about something small and green. It's about how that passion shaped their lives and landscapes. It's about how collective enthusiasm created temporary insanity that was simultaneously destructive and generative. It's a very human story. A story about seeking meaning, finding community, trying to connect with something larger than daily routine. A story about how we love, how we obsess, how we build our identities around the things we collect and study and cherish. The ferns don't care about any of this, of course. They just keep growing in gardens and conservatories, in the wild places where collectors can no longer reach them, in the spaces between paving stones where spores lodge and germinate. They're still here, still ancient, still patient, still whispering, for anyone who stops to listen, about time and survival, about beauty that doesn't demand recognition, about persistence beyond passion. The legacy in leaves, we're near the end now. The story has been told. The mania has risen and faded. The ferns continue growing, as indifferent to their legacy as they were to the obsession itself. But before we rest, before we let this history settle like dust on a Wardian case, let's consider what it might mean. What lessons, if any, lie hidden in this strange story of Victorian fern collecting? Not moral lessons. Exactly not thou shalt or thou shalt not, but something gentler. Observations, perhaps. Reflections on human nature as revealed through the peculiar lens of plant obsession. First, this passion is democratic. Pteridomania wasn't limited to any particular class or gender or education level. It swept across Victorian society, catching up laborers and lords, women and men, the educated and the barely literate. Anyone could collect ferns. Anyone could learn to identify species. Anyone could feel the thrill of discovery, the satisfaction of successful cultivation. In a rigidly hierarchical society where birth and wealth determined life outcomes, this democratic quality was revolutionary, though no one quite framed it that way. For a few hours each Sunday, in the forest hunting ferns, class distinctions faded. What mattered was knowledge, observation, persistence. This hints at a hunger for pursuits that judge you by your dedication rather than your pedigree for communities. Based on shared passion rather than inherited position, for ways of being that transcend social rigidity. Modern hobby communities, modern fandoms, modern enthusiast cultures, they often serve similar functions, offering spaces where mainstream status hierarchies are suspended, where knowledge and passion create their own hierarchies. We still need this, apparently. Still hunger for domains where we can be valued for what we know and care about, rather than who we are or where we come from. Second observation, we need to collect the human impulse to gather, sort, catalog, possess its deep and strange. We collect everything. Stamps and coins, books and records, experiences and relationships. We make lists, we complete sets. We organize our possessions into categories that matter intensely to us and mystify others. Pteridomania reveals this impulse in clear form. The fern collectors weren't wrong to find satisfaction in collecting. They weren't pathological. They were expressing something fundamental about human cognition. Our need to make sense of complexity by organizing it, creating order from chaos. A collection is a way of understanding. Each specimen added is knowledge gained. The collection grows and so does the collector's mastery of their subject. But collecting also reveals tensions between appreciation and possession, between love and ownership, between experience and accumulation. Can you love something without owning it? Can you appreciate beauty without capturing it? The Victorian fern collectors struggled with these questions, though often unconsciously. Their love for ferns was genuine. It was expressed through possession. The plant had to be dug up, brought home, placed in a collection to be properly valued. This reflects a broader Victorian worldview about nature, that humans could and should control natural world. Organize it, make it orderly and domesticated and safe. But it also hints at something more personal. The human fear that experience is insufficient, that memory fades, that unless we capture and preserve, we'll lose what we've encountered. The pressed fern in an album is proof. Asterisk, I was there. I found this. This moment of discovery happened. Asterisk, without the preserved specimen, does the experience really count? We still grapple with this. We photograph everything now, accumulating digital. Collections of experiences, needing proof that we've lived what we've lived. The impulse hasn't changed. It's only the technology. Third reflection. Obsession is escape. For Victorian fern collectors, the forests where ferns grew were refuges from industrial modernity. The careful tending of Wardian cases was respite from the demands of work and social obligation. Obsession gave them permission to focus, to shut out the world's noise. to care intensely about something manageable when everything else felt overwhelming. This is still true. Contemporary obsessions, whether with hobbies or fandoms or fitness, or professional achievement of funds, serve similar functions. They give us controlled spaces where rules are clear, where progress is measurable, where we can experience mastery and meaning. The world is chaotic and frightening and far too complex to understand, but a fern collection can be complete. A Wardian case can be perfected. Knowledge can be accumulated. Skills can be developed. Satisfaction can be achieved. Obsession, in this light, isn't pathology. It's coping mechanism. It's the human psyche saying, asterisk, I can't control everything, but I can control this. Asterisk, of course, obsession can become destructive. When passion eclipses all else, when the refuge becomes a prison, when collecting becomes compulsion that damages relationships and finances, that's when coping mechanism becomes problem. The Victorian fern collectors mostly avoided this extreme, though stories exist of those who didn't. Most maintained balance, kept perspective, allowed their passion to enhance rather than replace their lives. But the potential is always there in any obsession. The line between healthy enthusiasm and destructive compulsion is blurrier than we'd like to think. Forethought communities form around the strangest things. Pteridomania created community societies and clubs. Networks of correspondence, shared expeditions and meetings. People who might otherwise never have met found connection through ferns. These communities gave people identity beyond their prescribed social roles. A woman could be a pteridologist, not just a wife and mother. A clerk could be an expert, respected for knowledge rather than position. Community, turns out, can form around anything if people care enough. The specifics almost don't matter. What matters is the shared passion, the common language. It's a sense of belonging to something larger than yourself. This is hopeful in a way. Suggests that connection is always possible, that community can be built, that isolation can be overcome through shared enthusiasm, no matter how niche or obscure the interest might seem. It's also poignant, because it reveals how hungry we are for community. It's how willing to organize our lives around the slimmest pretexts for connection. The Victorians needed each other, needed belonging, needed to feel seen and understood. So they built communities around ferns. We're not different. We just use different organizing principles. Final observation. Beauty matters. The Victorian fern collectors were responding to beauty, the intricate structure of fronds, patterns of sori, the green abundance of ferny places. They found in ferns an aesthetic that satisfied something deep, and they were right to care about this. Beauty isn't frivolous. It's not luxury or distraction. It's fundamental to human well-being, the need for our surroundings to contain things. We find beautiful the need for our attention to rest on forms that please us. The Victorians surrounded themselves with fern patterns, not because they were silly or excessive, but because beauty in their environment made life better, made daily existence more bearable, more meaningful. We still know this, though we often forget. We need beautiful things. We need patterns that please, spaces that calm, objects that reward attention. Pteridomania was, among other things, a mass movement toward beauty. Ordinary people insisting that their homes, their lives, their daily experience should contain things they found beautiful, even if those things were just ferns. This is democratizing too. Beauty doesn't belong only to the wealthy or the cultured. A clerk could have a beautiful Wardian case. A teacher could create a beautiful fern grotto. A child could press ferns in an album and create their own beautiful record. Beauty can be chosen. It's cultivated, surrounded oneself with. Regardless of means, the Pteridomania story, then, is fundamentally hopeful. It's about ordinary people finding meaning and community and beauty in something small and green. It's about passion that enhanced lives, even when it occasionally went too far. It's about humans being weird and wonderful and strange in the particular ways that humans are. The mania faded. The societies mostly closed. The collections were dispersed or preserved in institutions. But for decades, for thousands of people, ferns mattered intensely. Ferns organized time and structured space. Ferns provided identity and community. Ferns gave reason to get up Sunday morning and walk into the woods. to spend evenings carefully tending collections, to study and learn and observe. And the lesson, if there is one, might simply be this. It's okay to care deeply about small things. It's okay to find meaning in hobbies and interests that others might find boring or incomprehensible. It's okay to build community around whatever shared passion brings people together. It's okay to seek beauty, to value aesthetics, to surround yourself with patterns and forms that satisfy something in your soul. It's okay, in short, to be human in all our peculiar, obsessive, meaning-seeking ways. The ferns don't judge. They just grow patient and ancient, offering their intricate beauty to anyone who stops to look. And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes the small green things hold everything we need. The light is fading now. Imagine we're back where we started, in a Victorian parlor. But the year is 1895. The fern mania is long past. The Wardian case in the corner hasn't been opened in months. Inside, some specimens have died, but others persist, growing according to their own ancient rhythms. Indifferent to neglect, the afternoon sun slants through lace curtains, casting shadows that look like fern fronds, though nobody's in the room to notice. The house is quiet. Outside, the city continues its business, carriages passing, vendors calling, the constant low hum of urban existence. But in here, there's stillness. The ferns behind glass exist in their own time, their own patience. They've survived the obsession that brought them here. They'll survive its ending too. Let's sit in this quiet space for a moment. Let's let the story settle. We've walked through forests with Victorian collectors, boots growing heavy with mud, searching for rare species among moss-covered rocks. We've stood in parlors examining Wardian cases, pressed specimens into albums, learned Latin names and identification techniques. We've watched an entire culture become obsessed with ferns, seen that obsession peak and spread and finally, gently fade. And now we're here, in the afterward. In the quiet that follows any story's ending, what remains? The ferns? Certainly. In botanical gardens and private conservatories, in wild forests where Victorian collectors once walked, in the spaces between civilization, where spores lodge and germinate and begin their slow growth toward maturity, the architectural details, carved fern fronds on stonework, fern patterns in ironwork, those permanent markers of a temporary madness. The collections in museums and archives, pressed specimens and albums, carefully labeled and dated, documentation of Victorian botanical enthusiasm, the stories passed down about great-great-grandparents who collected ferns, who belonged to societies, who spent their Sundays in pursuit of rare species, and something less tangible, the lesson that passion, even when it seems absurd from outside, is real and important to those experiencing it. That human beings need things to care about, need communities to belong to, need beauty in their surroundings and meaning in their days. The evening deepens. The parlor grows darker. The ferns in their case are barely visible now, just suggestions of green, shapes and shadow. Outside, the Victorian era is ending too. Queen Victoria will die in 1901, closing a chapter of history. The certainties and anxieties that characterize the age will give way to new certainties, new anxieties, but the ferns will remain. They were here before the Victorians. They'll be here after. They were ancient when the first humans walked the earth. They'll likely survive. Us all, there's comfort in that permanence. In the way ferns exist outside human time, following rhythms established hundreds of millions of years ago, we can obsess over them or ignore them. We can collect them carefully or leave them wild. We can name them in Latin or simply call them ferns. They don't care. They just keep growing. This is what the Victorians discovered. Though they might not have articulated it, that paying attention to ferns, two small green growing things, was a way of touching something permanent in a changing world. Something beautiful in an increasingly industrial landscape. Something peaceful in anxious times. The obsession was about ferns, yes, but it was also about so much more about finding meaning. building community, creating beauty, connecting with nature, participating in something larger than individual lives. And when the obsession faded, when other interests arose and attention moved elsewhere, the ferns remained, patient, ancient, indifferent, still, offering their quiet beauty to anyone who stops to notice. The room is fully dark now. Time to rest. Let the story of Pteridomania drift away like spores on air, like dust settling. Like the gentle fade of afternoon into evening, let the ferns in their case continue their slow growth, unseen in darkness. Following the only imperative they know: grow, reproduce, persist. Let the Victorian collectors rest in their graves, their passions and anxieties and obsessions finally quiet, their collections dispersed or forgotten, their names mostly lost to history, but let the lesson remain that it's okay to care about small things, to find meaning in modest pursuits, to build your life around the things that bring you beauty and peace and connection. The Victorians found those things in ferns. We can find them wherever our attention and passion lead us. The important thing isn't what we obsess over. The important thing is that we allow ourselves to care, to pay attention, to find wonder in the world's small corners, because that's where meaning lives. It's not in grand narratives or dramatic events, but in the careful tending of collections, the patient observation of growth, the quiet satisfaction of knowledge accumulated and beauty appreciated. In the parlor, the Wardian case sits in darkness. The ferns inside are invisible now, but they're still there, still growing, still participating in cycles that began before language, before history, before any human thought to press a frond in a book or give it a Latin name. And that's enough. That's always been enough. The deep quiet of growing things. The ancient patience of ferns, the gentle acceptance that some things simply are. Regardless of whether anyone notices or cares, rest now. Let the boring history wash over you, like shadows through a Victorian garden. Let the obsessions fade. Let the ferns grow. Let yourself drift, like spores on air, into whatever dreams await. The story is done, the ferns remain, and tomorrow, in some garden somewhere, a new frond will unfurl. Patient and green and perfect, just as it always has, just as it always will. Quietly, endlessly, forever. Sleep well.